Quick warning, the focus of this video is game critique rather than purchasing recommendations, so feel free to either buy or not buy the games regardless of what I say. And with that being said, I think it would be best to begin the video with a quote that I'm very fond of, which goes, "Genuine critique is worth more than thousands of copies sold." No, just kidding. No one has ever said this. One of the dangers of licensed games, reboots, and remakes is self-justifying design, where the game exists as a product first, and then the gameplay is just crafted to fit whatever the product demands. And the danger of this is that you end up creating a game that doesn't have a sense of identity if you remove the license, and I think that is the ultimate test of every licensed game, is you should ask, all right, if you take the license away, is this actually a coherent game in any sense? So if you take away the license of The Punisher, is it still a really good beat 'em up? Yes, it is. But in the case of Terminator 2D No Fate, I don't think this could be said at all because it relies so heavily on recreating scenes from the movie structurally that if you take the license away, none of it makes any sense. If Bitmap just showed their audience this game, everyone's looking at it like, okay, why are you randomly jumping all these different styles of gameplay? Why does nothing fit together? Where's the challenge? Where's the development? How do you go from Xenocrisis to this? And that is something that I've really noticed affects the critique of these games. IGN went so far as to write this article called
"Why the 2025 Terminator 2 Retro Game Needed to be Made."
But you notice this type of attitude doesn't happen with original games like Final Vendetta. In Final Vendetta, not only was no one saying, oh, we need a Final Fight-inspired game immediately, but when Final Vendetta came out, it was actually punished in reviews for its lack of originality. So it is interesting that as long as you slap a license on top of a game, how differently it ends up getting treated. And I think it's because with original games, we're looking for a unique vision, whereas with licensed games, we're just looking for comfort.
Terminator 2D is part Time Machine, part uncommonly terrific movie tie-in. In an insane world, it's the sanest choice.
And so let's begin with the run and gun sections of the game, because on paper, that's what you're thinking you're buying, this console-style Contra game. And I will say, as critical as I'm going to be of the run and gun sections, they are definitely the best aspects of its design, so I guess there is that. But unfortunately, the run and gun here is severely underdeveloped, both, I think, in an intentional way and in unintentional ways. So let's begin with the unintentional stuff. There are a lot of really clear oversights, like the fact you can override the auto-fire rate with your own much faster auto-fire. This not only breaks the game's balance in terms of damage output and like melting most of the enemies, but then on top of that, you can also do funky stuff with the movement. I think the developers, just from a visual level, if they knew you were able to do this, would probably do something about it animation-wise, because, I mean, it just looks ridiculous. So there's that really basic oversight. And then throughout the entire game's structure, it never really addresses stepping in any strong way. Stepping is the technique in running guns where you slightly scroll the screen forward and you bring enemies on screen, but since you're able to hit them before they officially activate, you can suppress most of the game's level design and enemy design just with this simple strategy. Metal Slug has sections like this as well, but it started counter-adapting with screen locks and pushing the player into encounters, and so that's something most well-done run-and guns keep in mind. And Bog was pointing out that in old-school style arcade run-and guns, they did something even better, where they had respawning enemies that were extremely dangerous, and so if you decided, I'm just going to sit here and camp, you're going to get overwhelmed by them. But console run-and guns, because they focus more on completion rather than credits, tend to be much more passive in their level design because they don't want to scare away novice players. And fun fact, the reason why Mega Man and Contra on the NES don't have respawning enemies is because the hardware literally couldn't handle it, and so the devs had to exclude them. And then once that precedent was set, that was it, and apparently we're stuck with it generations afterward.
Also, the game had to be playable enough and teach you to play within seconds, otherwise you'll be confused and you'll give up on the game. So getting that curve of difficulty just right is an important part of it.
In the making of documentary of the game, the designer did say that he wanted the gameplay to be learnable within seconds and expressed concern that if there was any frustration, the players would quit. This is a real mentality of a lot of these modern retro games where they want the aesthetics of classics, but they don't actually want arcade design itself because they're afraid it will alienate mainstream audiences. And so what you end up getting is what I like to call fairness poisoning, where they're so concerned with making the games approachable that they just remove the design of the game, essentially. And there are 3 key hallmarks here that we see all expressed within Terminator 2. The first is this ridiculously gentle difficulty curve. I think the Nintendo difficulty curve is way too lenient, and it's something that I wish developers would get away from. But we're going in a direction now where old school Nintendo games look vicious by comparison. The first stage of Terminator 2D might as well be a skippable tutorial, and then it doesn't actually ramp up until basically the end of the game. But by the time you reach the end of the game, you've only gotten to maybe stage 2 or 3 of
Metal Slug.
In terms of actual payoff. It's like ramping up to a difficulty that never happens. You never actually get to the meat of the design because they're so concerned about these extremely elongated difficulty curves. We'll see this with a lot of the entries for this year's list, but Terminator 2D might be the most severe example. So that's the first thing. The second is that all of the design is static without any overlap. You can have static elements in your game design. In fact, you should, to create a sense of structure, obviously. Otherwise, you have just pure chaos. But you want overlap. You want different elements to mix together so that if you're not en route, if you're not paying attention, you're going to get punished. Oh my God. I remember when this happened, I wanted to throw my controller on the ground and scream. But in Terminator 2, everything just comes at you one at a time. And the key example are the dogs. First off, the dogs commit the ultimate run and gun sin, according to Boghog, which is to have these chasing type of enemies with a bunch of health. If you see that, red flag, because the purpose of this enemy type is to be this overlapping element that you have to juggle along with the other enemy types. But if it has health, obviously you're not going to be able to do that. So instead, this chasing enemy type just becomes this little trap that you have to memorize. It feels very desperate that the game is like trying to harm you, but it's scared to have any kind of RNG or overlapping element. So it just needs tanky dogs to leap out at you or really fast bullets to fly out of those little satellite things. Other than that, the game is completely harmless, especially because you can duck under most of the enemy shots. So that's issue number 2, extremely static, no overlap. And then issue number 3, whenever the game has any type of maybe potential RNG or potential things that need to be reacted to, it's obsessed with telegraphing. And let me clarify, when I say telegraphing, I don't just mean the on-screen prompts. Those can be a problem if the attack is supposed to have some sort of animation reading, but I'm also talking about the built-in delay between the attacks, the on-screen stimulus to the punishment. That delay is also part of telegraphing, and you can tell Terminator 2D constantly extends this so that you can react perfectly comfortably. Some of the hallmark examples of this are those ridiculous turret mid-bosses, if you want to even call them that, where there's that turret wall, there's the cover, the game's like, yeah, stand behind the cover, fire at the turret wall. Okay, that's a very simplistic scenario here, but let's make it even more simplified because it's the same static sequence every time. And then on top of that, the game just tells you when it's going to fire, so you don't even need to look at the boss. You can cover half of the screen and just look at the telegraphed prompts and do the entire sequence. It is ridiculous. Another one is that plane boss where it has the swoop where it either goes high or low. And so this could be the type of pattern that could test the player's reactions and reading abilities, where they'd have to read where the ship is coming from and then react up or down like the Penguin in Batman Returns. But it completely telegraphs where it's coming from, and the delay is so long that you'd have to be fast asleep to get hit by this damn thing. And that is what you'll constantly see throughout the entire design of Terminator 2, and this is intended. The developer is always seeking out, okay, where is any sort of risk? Where is any sort of reaction or reading that needs to occur? Get rid of that. Telegraph it. The most absurd has to be the goddamn bike section, because the only possibly interesting thing you could do with this bike section is to test the player's reactions. That is it, because all it is simply press up, down, or fire. It's basically like the stripper sequence in Dead to Rights, where you do the button prompts on a rhythm, but even that is too demanding for a mainstream audience. And so it's completely static sequence-wise. It's 1, 2, 3, repeat. 1, 2, 3, repeat. It's so weird how roundabout we've just started making things into QTE sequences once again, where they're not technically QTEs, but that's what they amount to gameplay wise. And rather than being a small little sequence to break up sections, now they go on for entire levels. Someone explain the steel mill stage to me. How is this not getting eviscerated? There is nothing to this. This is simply an interactive cutscene with a few QuickTime prompts, and even the steam coming out of the pipes, once you know that there's not enough of them to damage you to kill you, you can just tank through them and run through it. It is complete filler. And why? Why does this stage exist? Well, it's in the movie. This is like a really cool sequence in the movie, so we've got to turn it into gameplay.
Terminator 2 has a number of iconic scenes in the film, and what we found in the game design phase was that they don't suit a particular type of gameplay.
Same thing with the supposed stealth stage. This is the type of stealth design that I need to hide from Boghog when I'm trying to convince him why stealth games are awesome. I'm like, okay, do not look at something like this, where it's completely static and scripted and so heavy-handed. Why not make this a beat-em-up stage? Why not try to have just two genres and then fit them in to whatever set pieces they want to fit them into? That way you would have some sense of escalating design. But no, you just have all of these little mini games that the developer clearly isn't taking seriously, and this stealth level can hardly count for actual gameplay, other than the interactive door locks. Now that is some skill-based design.
I know now why you cry.
And we're running out of time here, but I need to talk about the Rolling Thunder and beat-em-up sections. So the Rolling Thunder stages, like the headquarters and the police station, are a rare example of respawning enemies and potential overlap. So these could be the stages I could highlight as, oh, here's some enemy design, here's some level design. See, this is the strengths that I'm talking about. Except
Crouch fire is an unstoppable strategy.
technically the enemies will return fire with their own crouched shots, but since they are so slow to do this, and because the level design is just flat for the most part, it is not a concern. You can keep the entire stage completely suppressed with a combination of stepping and crouching. These are the types of details that you can get away with a casual review, but if the players start playing for 1cc's, which I did, which you have an official mode for, you gotta start challenging this stuff.
Trust me.
Which brings us to the beat 'em up stage. I'm a little bit lost for words. I'm a little confused because unlike other developers where you'd have to speculate, well, do they know about beat 'em ups? Do they know like the fundamentals of the genre? In the case of Bitmap Bureau, we know that they do, because their previous game is Final Vendetta. And even though Final Vendetta is not a masterpiece of beat-em-up design or anything, it's still really solid and obviously shows that the developers know how to make a beat-em-up So why did they throw out all of the fundamentals they've already established? And then on top of that, added in this shoulder drive attack that completely obliterates the entire balance of the punches and kicks and throws. You can just constantly run and tackle throughout the entire time. And then the walk speed is like painfully slow. This whole stage drives me insane. It has so many issues that I don't know where to begin. So luckily I found a guest reviewer to explain the problems.
You're the Terminator going around at a truck stop punching people. It's just a monotonous button masher, and it takes so many punches to put them down. All you want to do is run past them. But you can't do that, because guess what? The whole objective of this stage is to punch everybody out. Then you go in the tavern, like the first scene in the movie. Once again, you gotta punch everybody out. They keep coming out from under the bar. How many guys are back there? Then you come to the boss. But it goes on forever. In fact, looks like I'm jerking them off.
And I feel like we're going through this weird inversion of licensed game design, because all the licensed games, when they weren't done well, drove people crazy because they were janky and funky and hard to deal with. And now new licensed games are so determined not to be that way that they're letting you win constantly. And that's not game design either.
They're down! They're both down!
Especially because it's a never-ending pit. No matter how much you appease the average mainstream player, no matter how far you take it into AAA Last of Us yellow paint types of territory, there's always going to be the casual sect of players who are like, I don't know. There was a moment here where I had to learn some slice of gameplay.
And that's unacceptable.
I only wish you weren't limited to accumulating a maximum of just 9 continues. Whenever you have 9 in the bank, any further ones you collect are converted to bonus points instead. Failing on the last level does sting a little harder, knowing I could have easily had a few more cracks at it.
And so with this list, by the way, I'm making a superlative for each game and why I included them in the list. And I wanted to talk about Terminator because I think it is extremely relevant and highlighting a lot of design mentalities that we see in modern retro stuff. So the superlative I'm giving it is a little backhanded, but I can't help it, which is most commercially viable. This game has been lighting up the charts. It's getting massive viewership. It's getting massive sales. The difference in Bitmap Bureau's sales for their previous games and T2 is insane. And so over at Bitmap, I'm sure they are happy as clams with how this game has turned out. I know their next project is a licensed He-Man beat-em-up, so we'll see how that goes, but Terminator 2D is not setting an aspiring example. Which brings us to the second run and gun on the list, Neon Inferno. And I've been looking forward to this game's release for quite a while because I enjoyed the developer's previous work, Steel Assault, which was this Mega Man meets Castlevania meets arcade design philosophy. And even though it wasn't perfect, I think it was a very promising start. And then with Neon Inferno, they're building off of Steel Assault, but then also bringing in this Wild Guns gallery shooter element. And whenever we have these genre blends, I think it's important to ask, okay, but should the genres be blended together? Because this is very trendy and it sounds cool in concept, but with a lot of games that try to blend genres, you'll find that the designs conflict more than they harmonize. But in the case of gallery shooters and run and guns, I think they have a beautiful synergy with one another, so much so that I think it is actually important to ask the question, should they be distinctive genres? Or is it that these two subgenres, run and guns, gallery shooters, are pieces of a much larger holistic genre that just hasn't developed yet? Because in shmups, whether or not your shmup has foreground or background shooting does not create a different subgenre. For example, Rayforce or Crimson Clover or even Zero Ranger has foreground background shooting. And in fact, as shmups have become more developed, just the design element of including foreground background shooting is just part of their lexicon. But with running guns, there is something that is often missing from especially horizontal console style running guns, which is that secondary layer of variance, of enemy design, of enemy overlap. Boghog did a fantastic post about this on his Patreon about Mercs, and Mercs is top down, and he was pointing out that what makes a really good run and gun is it has that primary layer of the static enemy placements like we typically see in run and guns, but then that secondary layer of enemy variance and variation that keeps the game from being completely static and allows for a ton of replayability. And funnily enough, Neon Inferno, by combining these two genres together, has this structure now. It has a background firing element that you need to juggle alongside the foreground element of enemies attacking you. And while I don't think the execution is perfect, and we'll get to that, I think the concept is very strong. And then visually, I love this direction as well. This is very Mark style visual design, lush, hot, saturated. It really stands out, and I think looks better than Terminator 2, especially in terms of character design. And one note of praise that may sound odd, but we're going to see it return later on, is that Neon Inferno is very good at signifying visually what is in the foreground, what is in the background. It is very consistent and clear on that distinction, which is really important for these types of games. So let's talk about the actual execution. In terms of mechanics, they went a little overboard. There's too many mechanics, and I think the mechanic set that should just be eliminated is the whole bullet reflect system. Because first of all, it sounds cool on paper to have the ability to hit foreground objects into the background, but in practice what this almost always means is the developer just feeding you clearly created scenarios for this to happen, and you feel like the game is overly prescribed. Like there's that lounge section where the enemy throws the grenade and there's all those guys in the background, and you're like, okay, so I'm supposed to knock the grenade into the background, and you have these occasionally coming up, and I just don't think it's as interesting as actually forcing the player to juggle the disjoint. So I don't like these types of mechanics overriding that dynamic. You're kind of just shooting yourself in the foot in terms of highlighting the game's uniqueness. And then on top of that, just reflecting bullets generally. This game, I would say one of my major critiques of it is it needs more stuff firing at you, because you as a player have so much movement and so many tools. You've got a jump, a double jump, an iframe roll, which is kind of crappy, and I'm glad that it's kind of crappy, but the game needs to actually test these more. But then when you add in a reflect over the top of all that, it's just less active threats. One mechanic I did really enjoy, though, is the fast cursor speed, and I highly recommend you set that as the default. You do not need the slow cursor speed, honestly. Just stick with fast. That works way better and vastly improves the feel of the game. So now let's talk about the level design and enemy design. First off, I think stage 1 is pretty solid, other than that bike section. That bike section is clearly a tutorial of some kind. It's really boring and lame, and it should be just cut. Because when you're going for the arcade 1cc and you're having to do this bike section over and over, you're like, oh, kill me. So they should just cut from you get on the bike and then you fight the boss. But other than that, I'm really impressed with the structure of the game, and I'm not sure how much of this is completely intended or just a really happy coincidence of influence. Because remember I talked earlier about Terminator 2's insanely ramping difficulty curve and how I think developers need to start getting away from the traditional difficulty curve. And instead, what they need to start embracing are flatter, higher difficulty curves. So instead of going like this, they need to be like this, right? And since Neon Inferno is using the Mega Man style stage select, that means that it follows a flatter difficulty curve because you can choose whatever order of the main stages. And even though some of them are probably more difficult than others, they are similar enough where you have a nice solid difficulty throughout the playthrough. And then you get to the penultimate double stage. They've been playing their cave, and that is a big hike upward.
Perfect.
And it's not about linearity versus non-linearity. It doesn't really matter to me if the order of the stages were fixed or choosable. What matters is that they're flat. So I don't know if they were really sitting down and thinking about difficulty curves and structures, but it worked out extremely well. And then in terms of level design, Neon Inferno does a solid job of challenging, stepping, and locking the player into encounters. And there are two sections I want to highlight. So the excellent version is in the scaffolding section, where you have to platform across, and in the background you have all these guys firing at you as you're trying to do it. And then there are also screen locks that prevent you from just sprinting your way throughout, because if you just try to do that, you'll jump and there'll be nothing there and you'll fall to your death. But then on the other hand, the game doesn't allow you to just slowly inch forward, because what it'll do is after a bit, the screen will just push you. And if you're not prepared, it's going to either push you off the edge or push you into an ugly enemy situation. So I think the scaffolding section is a great example of using all of the elements of the level design. You've got foreground guys, background guys, a mid-sized enemy that tracks you. I love this enemy type. Plus the screen asserts itself. So gold star on this section. And then we have a pretty equivalent section with the staircase in the nightclub. But the problem with the staircase is, one, you're able to step the entire thing. So you're just able to slowly move upward and pick enemies off as they appear on screen, and they don't really have a good counterattack from you doing this. And then on top of that, even though there's this beautiful arrangement of background elements that could contain enemies, they just sprinkle in a few background enemies here and there that are also easily picked off. What they should do is they should make this section have a bit of a scroll to it, and then line that back section full of aggressive guys firing at you, maybe even bring back that persistent mid-sized enemy in there as well. And you could have a really cool vertically scrolling type of section happening, but instead it's just easily abused. And while I'm at it, I need to give a shout out to the boss fights of Neon Inferno. I think this developer has a real sense for making really fun, engaging bosses that make use of the background shooting. Not all of them are perfect, like the second to last boss. That thing has a pretty obvious safe spot in the left corner. But the final boss is really fun. And if I were to select what I think the best boss of the game is, it would either be the giant mech that you fight. That thing is really good, especially that bullet hell type of pattern it has. And then the other boss that I really like, that I wish we saw more of, is the double boss, where you have to fight two at once. And overall, I think if most players are able to get a hold of this game's control system and understand how to play it, and I think if they would have reduced some of the mechanics that would have made it easier for people, I think it would be a very popular, well-liked game, because it feels and plays extremely well. The enemy design, the level design is all rock solid. And special shout out to the robust practice mode of the game, because not only do you have a stage select, but there is a section select within the stages, which I made use of and I found extremely useful and quite uncommon for run and guns and non-shmup arcade games. Usually you just get the stage if you're lucky and maybe the boss, but this went the extra mile and I think it's fantastic. So if I were to give my biggest piece of critique of Neon Inferno, what I would like to see happen, I think the clear flaws of the game are, one, it's still a little too static. Even though it has the overlapping elements of the gallery plus the foreground run and gun, it needs some variation. It needs some RNG. And the game has the tools. It's not like other run and guns or something where this would be like a theoretical proposal. In Neon Inferno, the tools are there. They are at the developer's disposal. They have already created them. So, for example, that mid-sized enemy that follows you around, more of those guys. And then there's also this really cool, I guess I'll call super foreground enemy, an enemy that's in front of the player's plane. More of those guys. And then also add in some random spawns of them, because once you get a feel for timing dodges from foreground to background, you have a lot of room to work with. And then, of course, I'm going to point this out because it's really obvious. The game needs some kind of scoring system. But I will say that I do respect the developers for focusing on the survival gameplay first. I do think that is actually the better direction than what we see in a lot of retro indie stuff now, where they have no sense of survival design and then they just toss in a scoring system and they're like, there you go, skill, because you have a scoring system. So if you had to focus on one, I'm glad they actually focused on the survival gameplay. The irony, though, is because the survival gameplay is interesting and exciting, now you actually want to score the game. And so I think if they created one extra mode, like Neon mode, and it just did the following things. Removed bullet reflecting, there's no reflectable bullets, added way more enemies into the foreground and background, had some variation with enemy spawns, like the mid-sized flying guy and then some of the super foreground guys, and then had a scoring system, put all of those together with some online leaderboards, and I think you'd have a real beast of a game. Up next, we have BIRDCAGE, a Radiant Silvergun-inspired bullet hell shmup with Metal Gear-style visual aesthetic. Someone has been reading my diary because, of course, this is exactly the type of thing I would love to see and aims directly at basically all my taste preferences. So the question really is, does this game deliver on the premise? Because the premise is awesome. Let's start with the strengths of BIRDCAGE. This game is definitely putting its strongest foot forward in terms of its visual design. It has a real sense of aesthetic, and I don't just mean in terms of the graphics, though they are excellent, but also the way it presents the graphics. For example, the background work, where the game transitions through different scenes and set pieces using the background. And then on top of that, I like the additions of adding in light and shadow elements, and then even some visual color filters. It helps the game imprint itself in your mind. That's something that Silvergun obviously is extremely good at, as well as Ikaruga. And you can remember distinctive encounters in these games, not only because of the patterns and the set pieces, but also the way the backgrounds work, the way the scene transitions work. Zyga, the entrance of him into the scene, you're like, whoa, you know, it's that amazing cinematic feel that's really hard to get in this genre without interrupting the gameplay too much. And for the most part, BIRDCAGE nails this. There's some awkward moments where you look at and you're like, okay, this is an artifact from story mode that needs to get fixed. For example, one of the scene transitions just takes a little too long, so you're just staring at the background for like a few seconds. It's like, but overall, it's really good at doing that, and I think it gives it a lot of weight and potential crossover appeal in the right way. So gold star in terms of the visuals. Let's talk about the gameplay. So the greatest strength of BIRDCAGE's gameplay is that it has the priorities in the right place. What it is trying to do is good. And I do see that, and I do appreciate that. And I think a lot of people who are familiar with shmups and have played BIRDCAGE have felt the same way. It's like, okay, the vision, we all see the vision. It's just the execution of getting there isn't quite fully formed. And so what you end up seeing happening a lot with BIRDCAGE's gameplay is it struggles in a lot of sections, and we'll get to that critique very thoroughly here in a moment. But sometimes it actually nails it. And so there's moments where you're like, whoa, okay, it's working, it's working. And then I think what's happening is it's just inexperience. The developer isn't sure like how to maintain level design in like a really strong, cohesive sense. And so that's why the game feels so inconsistent to a lot of players, and why everyone's like, wait, is this good? Is this bad? I think the answer is it's both simultaneously. And so filtering through the moments where it's hitting where it needs to be hitting, I think will help bring us closer to what this game's potential is. So one of the big moments of the game finally coming together is the stage 3 mid-boss, because basically all of the stages up until that stage 3 mid-boss is this on-ramping thing like we're talking about earlier. But this on-ramping that BIRDCAGE is doing, I don't think is the same thing as like Terminator 2, where Terminator 2's developers directly say, we are aiming for this difficulty curve. We want it to be this gentle slope so we don't scare people. In the case of BIRDCAGE, I don't think it's quite intended that way. I think what it is that the developers themselves are a bit inexperienced. And so to them, they're playing stage 1 through 3 and they're like, yeah, this is ramping up. But if you're more of a experienced shmup player, you're like, it's kind of not though, is the problem. But what happens is that when stage 3 occurs, that mid-boss comes in, and the mid-boss, I think, is well done. It has bullet hell patterns that you have to dodge. It pushes you around the screen. It takes some practice and routing, and you're like,
Yes, it's working!
But the issue is that since all of the stuff preceding up that is low intensity, when the game snaps into focus, it kind of shocks you. You're like, whoa, I have to dodge bullet hell patterns all of a sudden? Difficulty spike, difficulty spike. And what I think is really important for shmup design is you need to set expectations early. So if you want this to be a treasure-style, intense, difficult game, you need to put that up front, because otherwise, more experienced players are going to look at this and say, oh, it's just a beginner game. And then newer players are going to be shocked when you actually expect them to dodge and route. So you're getting in this pincer of difficulty where you're not serving anyone. And like I said in the Terminator 2 review, if you spend too much time on-ramping, by the time the plane takes off, there won't be enough runway. And so it's not as severe here. I think the game begins essentially in the stage 3 mid-boss, but that's about almost half of the game that you're spending
Getting pumped up!
And then it ends, and you're like, damn, I kind of wish there was more game here, but not in the modern sense of like literally make the game longer. That's not the answer. Like the IGN review of Ikaruga that's like, yeah, just double the length of the game.
No.
The answer is the earlier game needs to ramp up harder and faster, and then that ramping needs to continue onward. And speaking of on-ramping, there's a bit of level design feedback that I think is really important to cover, especially in the case of BIRDCAGE, is with your level design, you need to create sections that are scalable difficulty-wise. You do not want static sections, because that means when you're playing normal mode and you're playing hard mode, you can't escalate the difficulty without just revising the stage anyway. So in stage 1, you have all of these barriers that you fly through Gradius style. The idea of introducing barriers and walls is that you want to constrain the space to then focus the enemy interaction. But if you're just trying to make environmental obstacles and that's it, that's not a meaningful skill test. If you look at the way Silvergun does it, you'll notice there are these long passages and there's enemies in them, and the narrowness of the passage makes it so you don't have a lot of room to maneuver in order to get around their attacks. It's actually a beautiful use of architecture there, but the way they're laid out in stage 1, the enemies cannot be a factor because it's not a tunnel, it's these hurdles that you navigate, and even if you stick enemies in there, there's just not a lot of dynamics that can happen. There's a better use of this later where you have those squares and then you have that elite enemy that flies around and attacks you from the squares. That's a better use of physical obstacles because it's tying in with the enemy design and it's scalable. So these are the questions you should just always ask when you're designing an encounter. Is this scalable? Could I make this viably more difficult in an interesting way, like Futari Original transforming into Futari Ultra? And now I want to talk about the stage timer and the enemy design because I think they go together. So if we look at the stage timers of traditional arcade stuff, like Ikaruga, like Silvergun, you'll notice that when the timer runs out, that usually means the boss will fly away and you're allowed to advance to the next stage. But the interesting aspect of this in terms of survival structure is that the game is actually rewarding you, survival, not score, for passive play, which is ironic because in the stage design and the enemy design, you're normally doing everything you can to punish the player for passivity. And so the way games like Silvergun counter this is with aggressive enemy design. And so even though it is systematically being lenient in practical level design, it is still very aggressive and works really well. The thing about BIRDCAGE that's interesting is that systematically it's more punishing, because if you run out of time, you game over, you die. But the problem with that is I think the developers are now leaning on that too much, because the enemies themselves are very passive. And in fact, I'll show you footage of me just not engaging with the enemy patterns. And after a bit, they kind of give up and fly away in these like clean little segments. And then the mid-boss will just fly around, and you can actually spend tons and tons of time playing the game extremely passively without getting punished in the enemy design. And then the way the game punishes you is by the time you get to the boss, you just don't have enough time and then you die. I mean, that's better than just allowing you to go past the boss when you run out of time, but you can't rely on systematic stuff like this. It's too disconnected. And if you look at something like Spike Out, which also has a similar timer system, Spike Out doesn't give you all of the stage timer up front. Instead, you have to complete segments to gain time. I think that would work much better because it's less scammable and it feels more immediate and more involved in the gameplay. And I think the best example of this happening in BIRDCAGE is the TLB. The TLB is on this strict little timer unto itself, and you need to beat it within that timer. And so what it means is that even though the patterns aren't the most intense things ever, because you're like, oh, I gotta kill this thing fast, I think it works super well. So you want this dynamic more frequently. Have all the bosses be like this. Which brings us to the sword. I want to begin by saying that I appreciate them striving for mechanical elegance by trying to give the sword a lot of versatility. But the issue is that they went overboard and gave it a bunch of sub-mechanics, and those sub-mechanics don't really work together super well, so it becomes a system in tension with itself. So we'll break this down function by function. The first is as an actual melee attack. And as an actual melee attack, I think it works really well, especially because it's very difficult to get melee attack systems in shmups to feel good and feel like they're useful. And I do think it comes down to the auto aim, because if you had to actually manually swing this around, which I know is an option on the right analog stick, or there's an option in the menu to do that, I don't like it at all, because then you're just babysitting the damn mechanic. Instead, you want the mechanic to be elegant and proximity-based, like Katsui's lock-on. And I think at its best, the auto-aiming of the sword achieves that at times. The issue is that you have so many other functions of the sword screwing around with this that it never feels quite right. Which brings us to its second function as a homing weapon. And that's where we start running into problems, because with the auto-aim, with a melee attack, you can always go back to proximity. But when you start getting into range stuff with homing attacks, then it gets a lot more iffy, because if I'm at the back of the screen, right? You see this in the stage 4 boss, where it has those two side pods. I want to hit the center core. That's where I want to aim my homing shot, but it keeps firing at the arms because those happen to be closer to me. That's a lot of stress on your homing targeting system, and players will notice every single time it doesn't work correctly. So I think that is where you got to rethink the sword. I don't think you should be using it as a homing weapon, especially because your default shot is kind of weak and it needs beefing up. It needs more purpose. And so maybe if you want to add more of a homing function into the weapon system, look at putting it into the default shot more, because trying to do both melee and homing with the same weapon, I think fundamentally is in conflict. And then we have function 3, bullet canceling. This, I think, is very easy. Get rid of it. No bullet canceling. Bullet canceling is like the parry of shmups. It can be done, but I think newer developers just need to be banned from it. Like if you're making your first shmup, you cannot have bullet canceling in your game because it causes so many problems with your level design, with your boss design, with your mechanical design, especially because the sword doesn't know where to swing already, and then it's flying at things, then you also need to cancel things with it. No bullet canceling, especially because this completely invalidates the second ship as being at all good, because it can't bullet cancel. So why would any player ever use the second ship? It feels like it doesn't even belong in the game, because the game has all of these bullet canceling patterns and the second ship can't do them. So on one hand, you clearly can play the game without bullet cancels. It's still totally viable to do so. But on the other hand, not doing it just seems stupid. And so rather than saying, well, give the second ship bullet canceling powers, I would say reverse it. Take away the bullet canceling. It instantly makes the patterns more interesting. It instantly makes the bosses more intense.
Just take the bullet cancels out.
And so final thoughts on BIRDCAGE. I am giving this game the superlative of most potential, because of all the games this year, the one I really want to see continue to be developed, and I mean this in a serious way, not in, oh, maybe someday you'll make another game and it'll be good. No, no. I'm saying BIRDCAGE. Go back to it, especially the level designer. The artist, you can go on vacation, you're good. Level designer, get back in there. You have the pieces, you have the potential. Now make it happen. Beef it up, ramp it up, look over these issues, revise them, because the funny thing about Shmups that I think is really tricky for developers is that you can't really see the game fully until you release it and then see how players are interacting with it and giving you feedback, which is brutal for launching the games. But at the same time, the player base is much more understanding, much more patient, and I think it is completely valid to just continue to work on a shmup after its release and like revise it. So yes, most potential. I'm hoping to see updates. Up next, we have Earthion. This is going to be interesting. So to start off, the presentation of this game is amazing in terms of the quality of its sprite art, its set pieces, its enemy design, its boss design, all extremely well done. This is the wet dream of Genesis fans in terms of crunchy 16-bit graphics.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't.
And I think if the game was just presented to you in photographic stills, one bit at a time, you'd be like, damn, this is one of the best looking Genesis games ever created. The issue is the game in motion, when it actually comes together, because as professional and well done as clearly the art is, when it comes to actually implementing that art into a shmup, there's a lot of really strange choices that took me a bit to uncover what was happening, but I think are very important to point out. So if you remember when it came out earlier this year, this game had massive bullet visibility issues in terms of the bullet sprites themselves. They have now updated that. And so when I pause the game and then look at the bullet sprites, it seems like these should have good visibility, right? I mean, they're contrasted, there's a bit of an outline, the outline could be thicker, but why isn't it working? Why do the bullets just jump out at you in these crazy ways? And then I realized as I was looking through the footage in slow motion,
oh my god.
With the visibility layers, everything covers these bullets. Your power-ups cover the bullets. Death explosions of the enemies cover the bullets. Your player's shot
covers these bullets.
And what might be the most insane is that your player's shot impact explosions also cover the bullet sprites. And so when you put all of these things together, you get a game of Crouching Tiger, Hidden, where you see an enemy coming at you on screen, you kill it, and then within the explosions of not only its body, but also your own shots, a stealth missile comes flying right at you.
And it's down!
And this is obviously an issue in normal difficulty with the intended bullet speeds, but it gets magnified much more the higher up in difficulty you go because the bullet speeds increase. So the time to catch the bullets visually is lower and lower. Meanwhile, you have all these explosions and effects covering them, and it's such a persistent, obvious issue that I started to gaslight myself like, is this a thing that I just never noticed? Do player explosions typically cover bullets? So I went ahead and checked Ketsui, and no. the player's shot impact explosions, and then the enemy death explosions. None of these cover bullets. So I thought about it some more. This might be a layer issue where the Genesis simply does not have enough background layers to put the explosions underneath the enemy bullet sprites. And so I did a little research, and it turns out, yes, the explosions and the enemy bullets are on the same sprite layer as one another. So that must be what's causing this issue. And I took a little bit of a deep dive. I'm not a Genesis programmer or anything, but apparently there is a way to create sprite priority even among the same layer. And so I thought, well, let's look around at other Genesis shmups and see if any of them have this figured out. So then I looked at Thunder Force 4, and yes, like Earthion, it has this issue of the player shot overriding the enemy shot in layers. But another thing that I noticed about Thunder Force 4, just going through the footage, is that it doesn't use that many traditional bullets. And when there are bullet sections, they tend to come from bosses or bigger elite enemies. It's just very hard to find lots of this popcorn dropping bullets everywhere type of things in Thunder Force. And I wonder if that maybe is because of this limitation. Who knows? But the Thunder Force developers seem to be taking the hardware limitations of the Sega Genesis more into account with their game design than Earthion is. So then I took a look at Musha, the best Genesis shmup, to see what it was up to, and it turns out Musha is doing something interesting because it doesn't have these bullet explosions for the player shot to begin with. Instead, it just has the flashing colors, so those aren't there. And then when the enemies explode and die, the enemy bullets are over top, despite being on the same sprite layer. So Musha had this figured out, at least the best that it could. So coming back to Earthion, what are we to make of this? Is it fixable? Is it not? Is this just a byproduct of the console's limitation? I don't know, but I do know that the final effect makes playing the game, especially in those higher difficulties, feel like a visual mess. And so if you're wondering why there's so many bullet visibility issues, it's not just the sprites. It's also the fact that the sprites are being constantly covered. And it doesn't help that there's hitboxes that don't make sense. Like in the space stage, there's these thrusters that look like they're shooting out steam. And when you look at it visually, it's like, oh, there's plenty of space in between these thrusters. I can just safely go in between them. Yeah, that's a kind of cool bit of level design. No, the space between the thrusters, that negative area, is pure hitbox. If you try to fly into that, you are going to take damage.
Fire blast!
The fact that the developers thought that was okay and how poorly communicated this game is visually gives me the impression that the primary goal of Earthion is to just look good. But as a shmup, it clearly has much higher ambitions than what the Genesis hardware is able to perform, which leads me to a humble question, which is, when you have a vision of a type of gameplay that just cannot run super well on this nostalgic console, why does it have to be on the nostalgic console? Back in the day, Thunder Force 4, that was it. They had to work with the Genesis, and so they had to deal with whatever limitations it has. But these days, you don't actually need to make it for the Genesis, especially because I didn't buy it on the Sega Genesis. I bought it on Steam. And so as a PC shmup player who spent $15, is it reasonable for me to expect these issues to be fixed? Or is it that since it's originally released on a retro console, that gives a free pass to the PC port to maintain the limitations of the console? Personally, I don't think so. I think it is the responsibility of whoever's doing the PC port to take advantage of what this platform, this hardware has to offer, because remember Battle Garega Revision 2016? Remember that M2 went in and added bullet visibility to a game that for decades was notorious for its poorly visible bullets.
Oh! See,
and there we go. That's the run from Eaglet.
Yeah, from Eaglet. But did you see what happened there?
Not exactly.
Where
no.
he bombed, and it caused a sprite limit, and all his bullets disappeared. So he probably didn't even see what was going on. So that's one of the issues with the PCB.
Yep.
And so I don't think it's beyond Bitwave to do stuff like this for the PC version. If it can't be done on the Genesis cartridge, it is what it is, but it can be done on PC. I firmly believe that. Also, while we're at it, why don't you include save state support? Apparently, according to Hardcore Gaming 101, the developer stated that they're not going to include this because it's too close to cheating. If that's the case, I'll refer you to Full Extent of the Jam, which was written in 2010.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
Especially because the game already makes the compromise of the password system, so this isn't some last stand of true hardcore gaming or something. And speaking of hardcore gaming, let's talk about the shield system, because it's not only an issue of balance, I think it's an issue of identity, because this game is presenting itself visually, hardware-wise, with this big commitment towards reliving the Genesis past, reliving the old-school days of kick-ass 16-bit shmups and all that, which, okay, let's do it. But then, if you're going to do that, why are you adding in this modern lame-ass shield system? Yes, older 16-bit shmups, and those are far from perfect, had shield systems. They were very generous, and then even Gradius had a shield system. But what takes Earthion into the modern gaming category is the fact that it auto-recharges. That means it has no resource cost, unlike Gradius, where you have to spend power-ups to gain shield, and also means there's no resource limitation like Thunder Force, which limits where you can get your shields and when.
When your shields are down, you need to know where the next one will be.
And that creates a dynamic in the run, especially because these resources usually require risk to get, or they should, when they're designed well. But in Earthion, it actually inverts this by rewarding avoiding risk. And that's just the player. The way this shield system affects the overall design of the game has a cascading effect, I think. So first off, any sort of downtime is not only a waste, but now it actually affects the balance because it allows the player to recharge their shields. That feels good in the short term, but it severely damages the potential for long-term consequences, because if you take 5 hits in stage 1, for example, and then are able to regain yourself on the route, that means the difference between taking 5 hits and taking 0 hits doesn't really matter, because the shield system paves over any long-term consequences. And then in terms of level design, even if you try to make very tight, intense encounters, if the player can identify there is a sort of safe area within that encounter, the player does not need to worry about the usual issues of screen control, positioning, enemy hitboxes. You can just tank that and then get in the position that you need to be in. So a lot of the natural risks and rewards in terms of level design go right out the window. And so to compensate for the auto-regenerating health bar, which is clearly abusable, Earthion had to add in a second health bar with the weapon power level. If you're playing Earthion on normal, the following analysis of the weapon power level doesn't really apply, because you can just abuse the shield system for the 1cc pretty easily. It is ridiculous how passive the normal difficulty of this game is, but I do think that is the intended difficulty, just based off of the bullet speeds and based off of the enemy health. But what ends up happening is that as the game escalates in difficulty in hard mode and in hotshot mode, it decides, well, how do we make this game harder? I know, why don't we make the bullets faster and give the enemies more health? And that is essentially how Earthion increases its difficulty. In fact, there are some patterns in Hotshot where the bullets are so small and fast, they're like the invisible Tetris blocks in TGM. You just have to know that they exist and then dodge them hypothetically. Like, okay, the bullets should kind of be here. I'm just going to dodge anyway. You just fly at the back of the screen and pray you have enough DPS to suppress the enemy fire. But getting back to the weapon system, why this is relevant is because this power-up bar becomes essentially a health bar in the higher difficulty, because DPS is what kills you or keeps you alive. And so when you take hits in hard and in hotshot, it doesn't matter in terms of your shield. It matters in terms of your weapon power. Because if you are depowered in certain stages, even Jamers says you might as well just crash and die because the game does not have a sense of balance. It doesn't have a sense of recovery. Whereas you look at Gradius, no matter where you are in the run, you can hypothetically recover, and the rank system and the checkpoint system makes sure this is feasible because when your power is high, rank is high. When your power is low, rank drops down to compensate. So you're not getting in these situations where you have no firepower and yet you're shooting at... And so what ends up happening is that you have this really weird, uneven design where the boss fights and a lot of the set pieces are incredibly easy because they're not scalable. We talked about that in BIRDCAGE. But then random popcorn encounters are like terrifying because the popcorn have become mid-sized tanks health-wise, and then you can't see anything because of the visibility issues. Holy mother of God.
It's a scratch!
And speaking of difficulty scaling, we need to talk about the final boss rush because in normal mode, it's perfectly fine. It makes sense. It's balanced. It's too easy like the rest of the mode, but it makes sense. Okay. So then we go into hard mode and they're definitely turning it up. The movement speed gets much higher. The bullet speed gets much higher. The health goes up, of course. It is brute force, and it rewards routing more so than it does dodging. But, I mean, that is this game's entire philosophy anyway, so I guess might as well finish off the game with this kind of mentality. But then we go to Hotshot, and what they do with these final set of bosses feels like a meme. It feels like a parody of bad difficulty scaling because it is just chaotic nonsense. The bullet speeds and spread of the guy's shotgun attack is unbelievable. You need to be a TASBot to reliably dodge them. And so instead, what you need to do is get behind the guy and hit him with a back shot or hit him with a side missile. You cannot fight him straight on. And his movement is so fast that even if you really precisely time shooting him in between the shotgun blasts, you're gonna get clipped. So what this means is that if you don't have some sort of back shot or side shot available, it's over. Done. I don't know how much practice could help you in this scenario because it's not just the question of landing a bunch of extremely clutch dodges. If you don't have the laser or a really high-powered weapon, your basic shot will do nothing to him. So basically, the weapon routing is required for this to even be viable. All right, sure. That's just him. And then you get to the turret wall. And while it is possible to dodge it for extended periods, again, it's just chaotic nonsense flying at you at turbo speed. And so what ends up happening at the end of Hotshot is it just becomes a pure resource check. It might as well be that laser beam that Mother Brain fires at you at the end of Super Metroid and just does a guaranteed amount of damage and checks, oh, did you get enough health tanks? And that's what poor difficulty scaling looks like. If the fundamental skills of the genre, like dodging, barely matter, that's not what you're looking for. And so my final thoughts on Earthion are a little tricky because underneath all the critique of the visibility, the auto-regenerating shield, the weirdly centralized weapon power-up system, and the tanky enemies, underneath all of that, I think there exists a really solid console shmup that I could see myself getting into, especially given how great this game looks. And so for my superlative, I'm giving Earthion Best Sprite Art Award because clearly I think the main driving idea behind it was making kick-ass sprite art. And there is a lot of modern retro stuff that tries to do this, but very few of them are able to deliver in an authentic way like Earthion does. It's just a shame that we can't get more of an authentic gameplay feel as well. What if I told you that after 2 decades, the director of Ikaruga and Radiant Silvergun has returned with a brand new arcade game? Don't you think that would be very exciting to hear? Don't you think if you were doing the marketing of said game, you might want to mention that somewhere, perhaps directly in the trailer? Apparently this thought never occurred to M2 because Night Striker gear has this man's signature design. This isn't a Mighty Number 9 situation where some guy in the marketing department for Mega Man's like, oh yeah, here's a new game that's like Mega Man. No, this is absolutely part of his body of work. And so far, no one has talked about this, and it is M2's fault. This time, there is someone to blame because there's the idea of the hidden gem. This is a buried gem. I don't think M2 could have done a better job of concealing this game's release. So this sucker came out in October, and then because of the meh quality of Salamander 3 and the fact that M2 didn't mention the Ikaruga developer was involved, I thought, I'm sure it'll be decent. I'll get to it when I get to it. But man, get to it, because this game is incredible. Let's talk about this game's mechanics, or should I say, lack of mechanics, because you know what is missing? I don't know if Ayuchi got the memo, but it is legally required for every rail shooter these days to have an iframe dodge or roll, which I'm getting tired of. Because in every rail shooter, even good ones, whenever you get into those really nasty overlaps, you can just
do a barrel roll.
But you can't in Night Striker. You need to manually move, which makes the patterns far more interesting and real. So the lack of dodge roll, that's really sick. And then in regards to the game's first actual mechanic, let's talk about the bomb system. And you may be scratching your head and looking down at your controller and saying, what bombs? This game doesn't have a bombing system, but it does, inside the enemies. If you shoot a red enemy leader, as it's called, it will explode and destroy the surrounding division, like a charged shot. And I want to point out that other rail shooters would just have the player-driven mechanic of the charge shot to have this effect, because if you think about Star Fox 64 and the enemy layouts and then Night Striker gear in the enemy layouts, you can see the red enemy leaders as being equivalent to those central enemies that you fire your charge shot at. And doing so in both games gives you a scoring reward. So what's the difference? The difference is with a player-driven mechanic, the best the developer can do is give you soft incentives. They can encourage you with score and with tempting enemy formations. But ultimately, if you decide, you know what's even better? I'm going to fire at the ground with my charge shot, and it turns out this gives me way more scoring bonuses than you were ever expecting. The developer has no answer for this because you've let the player loose with this mechanic and they can do whatever they want, no strings attached. But by containing it within the enemy design, like we're seeing in Night Striker gear, that gives the developer more ability to create structure in the levels, because if you want this bomb to go off, you have to interact with that red enemy, which could be really bad if you're just a lame developer with bad level design and you just line them up in these boring static ways. So there is that danger, but Gear manages to avoid this by slightly altering the enemy layout compositions from run to run, and then also by changing which enemy is the red leader. So this shows if you know what you're doing, and you know how to create really interesting risk-reward trade-offs and push the player around the screen and create a whole dynamic effect, then having that hard requirement snaps the level design into focus immediately. Just like you are drawn to the power pellets in Pac-Man because they allow you to counterattack your enemies. That is Ayuchi's signature. That's what sets his games apart. It's not just the mechanics he chooses, it's how the mechanics interact with the enemy placement. And the red leader system makes it happen. And now let's talk about the gear system, the power bar that you see at the bottom of the screen. And when you activate gear, you turn into this mech and unleash rapid homing fire. For the Ikaruga fans out there, this reminds me a lot of
the release energy mechanic.
And it works in a similar fashion. And if another developer made something like this these days, they would have the gear system be auto-recharging, so that you'd basically just fire it, it'd have a cooldown, and then it would recharge, and then you'd fire it again. Extremely lame, because if you have a very strong attack that recharges itself what ends up happening is that the correct way to use this attack is constantly, all the time. A good way to think about this is, what is the skill of holding the resource? Is there a skill? Does the game actually reward you for being able to hold a resource long term? One of my favorite examples is in Devil Daggers with the homing daggers. If you're a kind of mediocre player like myself, as soon as you get into the midpoint of the run with all of those crazy enemy spawns, you're firing off your daggers because dealing with them with just your baseline moving and shooting is really dangerous. But if you're a top tier player, you want those daggers for critical sections in your route, so you hold on to them despite the increased risk short term. And so one way to evaluate this dynamic is, do different players of different skills spend the resource at different times and for different reasons? If you have all of those questions answered, that means you have depth, you have range, which is exactly the case for the gear system, because when you first start off, you're going to be firing homing shots as soon as you get them. But then as you route the stages, you're going to start saving them for mid bosses or end bosses or duckies. And then you start to route for between the stages, because if you don't kill off the bosses fast enough and time out, you don't get a gear gauge refill. And then when you come into the beginning of the next stage, you don't have anything to deal with that first onslaught, and that can snowball from there. And so as you're playing through for the 1cc, you're not only routing your drive gauge for within the stages, you're also routing it between the stages. And that is what we like to see. So how do you get more gear power? There are two primary ways. The first are with these contextual tunnels, we'll call them, that you fly through. When you fly through them, they recharge your gear. Why this is really cool is, like we talked about earlier, this ties back into the level design in a concrete way. If you want more gear power, which you do, you have to go to this location, which creates a focal point. And at that focal point, the developer can put enemies, hazards, risks. Oh no! Which is exactly what Ayuchi does. One of the classic examples is in the first Sky stage. There's a section where there's the gear tunnels, and then there's these nasty jets camping out near them. And so if you try to just directly fly into the gear tunnel, you're going to get nailed by these missiles. And so instead, what you need to do is you need to anticipate the jets and then pull your position upward to misdirect their missile fire and then drop down. But if you don't know about the enemy layout and you just reactively fly through the tunnel, you either need to take or then pull out of the tunnel, but now you've missed out on the gear power, which you really want. And so by making the gear power-ups a physical object or tying it to killing the red enemy leaders, which is the second primary method, it allows the system to interact with the level design and the enemy design in a way that it can't if it's just self-perpetuating. And on that note of physically manifesting resources, I have to shout out the little ducky that drops the extra shield items. I really love this system as well, because the placement of the ducky is always in the most obnoxious spots possible. And I mean that in a good way. Not because you need to figure out where it is, but because it's placed in dangerous locations or in weird sticky situations. And so if you just fly for it and try to you often get nailed by tons of other stuff, or you take damage trying to get the shield and you actually end up losing more shields than you gain.
I almost lost a shield trying to get a shield, so...
It's just these little touches from these veteran arcade developers that really set them apart, because they know we should never give you something completely for free. There always needs to be some sort of risk attached. Level design wise, I love how dense and compact the stages are. The enemy formations come in on top of each other too, so you don't have that really ugly segmentation that you often see in weaker rail shooters where it's like wave, okay, fire, kill, all right, okay, here's the next wave. Everything's segmented and isolated. That's a problem we see in shmup design generally, but it's especially a problem in rail shooters because of the way the attacks in rail shooters work. They aren't persistent hitboxes like in shmups, especially Bullet Hell. Bullet Hell's signature are slow-moving, persistent hitboxes that trap you. Whereas in rail shooters, because it uses this Z-axis for the bullets coming at you, they come and go like Psycho patterns. They don't hang around. Though Night Striker gear does add in some persistent attacks for the bosses, which is really cool. But in terms of the stages, the way you make this work, and I think Night Striker gear is one of the best to do it, is that you have the enemy waves overlap. That way it creates almost like this bullet web that you're moving through in 3 dimensions and actually tests your ability to read the Z-axis, which theoretically other Space Harrier types of games should be able to do, but they don't have the same strong backbone of level design that Night Striker gear does, and I think that's what sets it above most other entries in the genre. So that's the level design. Now let's discuss the structure. I'm talking about the branching paths Darius style. Darius fans, cover your ears. I know Night Striker gear inherits this format from Night Striker, the original game in the series, but I do not think this is a good way to do level structure because you've got Night Striker gear with all of these different stages, and we can all agree the best stages are the back 2 rows and then the final secret stage. And so if you think about this in terms of getting the player the best access to what your game has to offer, this branching path model makes no goddamn sense, because the weakest stages would be stage 1 and then the first branch. And when you play in this style, you always have to play
the weakest stages,
and then you get a brief glimpse of the meat and then you hit the end. Think about this if you were a Mega Man fan and you played the intro stage to Mega Man X, and then you played Chill Penguin, then you played one of the other stages, and then Final Maverick Confrontation, and the bulk of the rest of the game is just not accessible. It doesn't make sense. You never get that beautiful, sustained, flat difficulty curve that creates that distinctive arcade feel. And if you want to have multiple stages with multiple routes, why not use a Death Smiles style structure where you can choose the order of the stages and then they escalate in difficulty based off of where they appear in the order. And then if you want a flatter difficulty curve, which I recommend, you can just choose the highest rank at the beginning and then all of the stages lock you in to that commitment. It's the way to go. You get all of the benefits and none of the drawbacks. And so when I first played Night Striker and saw this level structure, I was pretty disappointed, but turns out there is a solution. But before we get to the solution, we need to talk about how M2 have completely nosedived in terms of features for this release, because typically, we all know M2 shot triggers do an amazing job with their ports, and ironically, Night Striker 1 in the collection has all their features, so it's just their own original game that they abuse and neglect. Sounds like a complex M2, something's up here. But basically, they did everything wrong. Outside of the game itself being fantastic and having good performance, everything else about this release is pretty much a mistake. So first off, they allow credit feeding. Great. Now no one takes the difficulty of this game seriously. Even Earthion does not allow credit feeding. Granted, they have a password system, but that's better than credit feeding. Anything's better than credit feeding. And then on top of that, they decide to add some lame-ass meta progression thing happening where you gain more credits based off of every hour you play. What is this
retention garbage?
And then there is no stage select. Now, I think every arcade genre game must have a stage select when it's released. It's just part of your baseline features. It's like releasing a fighting game with no training mode. Are you insane? Of course you need to have a stage select, but it's especially stupid in Night Striker Gear because this game has a shitload of stages and you can't access most of the later stages without grinding through the earlier stages in this branching path system. And then, on the topic of the branching path system, they didn't split the leaderboard. So if you have to have this branching path style, you must split the leaderboard. because what that means in terms of score play, there's only one viable route. Whatever the highest scoring path is the path you must play. I guess their solution was they just stick an ending stage on your score submission, so I guess you can tell yourself that you have the high score, which is really bootleg. All this is pretty bad, but the worst decision by far is to take the best mode of the game and call it B-sides, as in the stuff that wasn't good enough to put on the album. So when you're reading a review and it's like, oh, you can unlock B-sides, that sounds like when you can unlock gallery mode. Like, oh, great, gallery mode. What they should have called it is conquest mode, like in Ikaruga. When you tell someone, have you played Ikaruga conquest mode? Everyone's like, damn, that sounds awesome. I'm playing conquest mode. B-sides? That makes Destiny sound good. And what is worse is not only did they give it a dumb name, but they also hide it like they're ashamed, and they don't even indicate to you that it's unlockable. So it's completely possible that people will buy this game, credit feed their way through it, and that's M2's fault for allowing that, and be like, it's all right, because they've presented everything wrong. They've done this game such a disservice. So what's awesome about B-sides? Well, first of all, it addresses this structural issue of breaking up the stages into these branching paths and these little bite-sized snacks. Now you can get the full experience, beginning to end. And it's not overly long either. 30 minutes, that's a solid runtime. To me, it feels like B-sides mode is the real game, and then they broke it up into this Night Striker homage, but it works so much better in this format. This should be a mode that when you open the game, the other two modes bow to it at the menu select. And you can tell that this has damaged its reputation, because if you look on the online leaderboards, which you have to unlock, by the way, no one is playing it. There is only one soul in Japan who has cleared hard mode of B-sides. And yes, it's very difficult, so that's part of it, but also just the number of entries. No one's playing it. M2, you know I'm your biggest fan, but pull yourself together. This is embarrassing. So, with that said, I want to quickly touch on the game's presentation before we get to our final thoughts. Overall, I love the way this game looks. I think its art style is really cool, and the background work looks fantastic. It has a distinctive vibe that I'm really digging, but in terms of its overall production, it feels unfinished. And I know that's reviewer code for it looks like, but that's not what I mean. It looks good, but it looks like a painting that stopped before they added the final details. You can tell they should be there, but they're not there. So like the player car sprite, it doesn't have any animations going on with it, really. It's just a static image. It reminds me of Battle Traverse, where they're just like flying PNG files. That's kind of what everything looks like, especially the mech. Don't look at the mech too long, because you start to realize, same thing with a lot of the enemy sprites. They're just flying images that kind of judder around. The closest comparison I can think of is the finale of Evangelion, the television show, not the movie, where they run out of budget and it just becomes like line drawings like that, which I vibe with it. I get it, but you also know, oh, the production just stopped. That's what happened. And I think that's what happened with Night Striker Gear. The production just stopped. So, conclusion, we need Shot Triggers to do a remaster of their own game. That's the only way we can get them to add features. We got to convince them to remaster Night Striker Gear. Make that happen. So, final thoughts. All issues with the release aside, I think this game is amazing. I plan on playing it in Shmups Lam 8, and you can damn well bet it will be the B-sides mode. That is the mode to play all day, every day. And if I have to hack the damn game in order to get a stage select to happen, maybe that's what I'll do. And so in terms of my superlative, this one is fun because like the Academy Awards, I'm giving this game Best Director, which goes to Hiroshi Aiuchi. So let's talk Touhou. For this year's selection, I could have gone with either Touhou 20 or FDF3. And the reason why I went with FDF3 is because with mainline Touhou, and I'm not an expert or anything, this is just an outsider's perspective to the series, it feels like it's entered a period of stagnation where it's not really building towards anything in particular. A sort of funny comparison, but I think makes a lot of sense, is with a lot of Nintendo legacy IPs like Mario or Metroid, or with Capcom Mega Man, where they've been very foundational in setting a subgenre of game design and then sort of ended up trapped within their own subgenre. Because if you look at Touhou's design, it's basically a slice of bullet hell, especially boss fights and these types of readable, reactable patterns. And it feels like because the game is known for being exactly this way, then any sort of structural shifts in that core is just a temporary experiment rather than a lasting overhaul. For example, the 6-stage structure. To me, this is an obvious weakness of the formula because the first 2 stages are not that consequential. In the Touhou replay showcase, shout out Gastari, they just fast forward through the first 2 stages and start watching the replay around stage 3 or so. But now it's so cemented in as part of the tradition that it's just stuck like that, probably forever.
For a sec, I was about to tell you, could you please release Shift, George?
Normal lunatic player reaction to watching an easy mode replay.
It reminds me of a sitcom a little bit, where you have the core cast and the core scenario, and then every episode is sort of a twist and play on that scenario. But like sitcoms, at first it's like, awesome, yeah, because we've got a lot of meat here.
You are my friend, aren't you?
Of course I am.
And that little thing with Topanga?
Well, I think the 3 of us could be very happy together.
So you look at that early Windows Touhou era, that's season 2, that's season 3, that's when everything's firing on cylinders, coming together. But then as you get further and further into the sitcom, you start hitting season 8, season 9, the dreaded season 10. The writers just start to lose ideas, they start to lose inspiration, and they start coming up with more off-the-wall stuff.
You're coming back home with me.
Hey, I want to hear them sing.
You are.
If I just had a blind Pepsi challenge and didn't know much about the series, and you asked, okay, which one of these is the official series? Which one of these is the fan game? I think most of us would be like, FDF3. Obviously, look how gorgeous and polished its art is. Look at its sense of presentation. It does feel like it's building off of those early Touhou games, at least in terms of the way it's presenting itself. And then you look at Touhou 20, you're like, oh, okay, fan artist did this. He upgraded the artwork a little bit. The backgrounds look a little off, though, I will say. The backgrounds, they don't have that handcrafted, charming feel of the old Touhou. I don't know why exactly that is, but I'm not really digging the look of those backgrounds. But FDF3 backgrounds, holy crap, there's actually enemies down there. And look, they're using like ground units and stuff. And look, we've got flying platforms. Zun has discovered walls.
This is really exciting.
And the crazy thing about Touhou and how many there are and how there's all these different spin-off games, for all I know, in some game somewhere, Zun did use ground enemies and did use platforms and did use walls. But going back to my point earlier, anything he does feels like a temporary experiment. And then let's reset back, because I looked all through Touhou 20, no flying platforms, no ground enemies. There's the obligatory mechanical twist that he adds, but doesn't stand out. When you look at FDF3, it's starting to set itself apart. I have to give Zun credit for allowing this in the first place. That is extremely cool that he does that. But interestingly, because FDF is a fan game and a very well-produced fan game, I think the developers are more eager to start to shift away from that core "this is Touhou" identity. For example, one of the later bosses has a leather jacket and a machine gun and bleeds. And it feels like what must have happened at FDF headquarters is they're like, all right, everyone, there's no more cute things. We have run out of everything. We've got bunnies, we've got kittens, we've got candy, we've got flowers. We need something that's not cute. It's machine gun time. And this is an aesthetic thing. And usually I don't get this interested in aesthetics, but Touhou's aesthetic is so oppressively consistent that any sort of shifts in its visual presentation is like, whoa, leather jacket. But with the official Touhou art, if you strapped me to a chair and then asked me which of these games is which, unless there's an obvious mechanic like the ice or something, I'm doomed.
Who's that Pokemon? It's
Touhou. One of the main challenges of reviewing a Touhou game is trying to establish a value set for the individual games, because talking earlier in the review about the Touhou formula is that it gives you a very strong foundation in the fundamentals of bullet hell dodging. That's why Touhou, I think, is one of the best series to help get you into bullet hell, because it teaches you how to sight read bullet patterns, and it doesn't have a lot of strong memorization or even that much snowballing. You'll notice that the patterns are all segmented into individual sequences, and then you try to get through that sequence and you either perfect it or not, and then you go on to the next sequence. So it's a trainer for dodging, essentially. And that's a really powerful strength in terms of getting into the genre, in terms of consistency, in terms of preserving the fundamentals. All great stuff, and something that I really appreciate about Touhou, especially these days where we're losing a lot of fundamentally based bullet hell. But that's also a bit of a double-edged sword, because once you understand the core Touhou system, the games individually are going to struggle to distinguish themselves from one another. It's very easy for you to go from game to game almost as one continuous sequence, like you're playing Beatmania or something like that. And so I would say, as an individual game, you have two options. The first is to just Touhou even harder. So take that core fundamental Touhou formula and just really work it. And that's why I think a lot of the early Touhou games are so beloved, because that's exactly what they did, and why they continue to hold up is because they did that extremely well. And so as we're getting further and further away, and a lot of this has been explored, I think option 2 is the more viable one, which is, okay, you've got the Touhou formula, now you need to start shifting it and introducing elements that previous Touhou games just don't have. And that essentially seems to be what Zun is doing with his various games lately, bringing in unique twists and all that. But I mean more on a fundamental level. For example, FDF3 is experimenting with ground enemies, with walls, but it feels like it's holding back, because I think it needs to start introducing more hard memorization elements into the series. It's got the hard aesthetic of the leather jacket and the machine guns, but it needs routing to individualize itself, because a series that's actually quite similar in a sense to Touhou is Metal Slug. Metal Slug has a formula, Metal Slug has an aesthetic. Playing Metal Slug, there is a core skill set that crosses all of the games. But one reason why I can't just go from Metal Slug 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 is that you have to get to learn the individual stages of every single game, and you will find underlying patterns and underlying tendencies that become sort of a shorthand, but that initial routing process still needs to happen, because you can't totally anticipate what's around the corner. And in today's fairness-obsessed design, this value is not being discussed very much. But routing is a very important part of a game bonding with the player. You'll notice the games that you've learned and routed are the games that you remember. Why I constantly blab on about Donanpachi is because I spent such a long time routing every inch of that game. And in that process, I got to know the game extremely well. I even started to create little nicknames for various sections of the game, like the Hall of Hell. I named it that because it was a very distinctive landmark of level design. But with Touhou, what has names? What do people remember? The boss patterns. Touhou has the boss fights down. You guys did it. Mission accomplished. Touhou is so successful in its boss fight design, it's become just the general template of 2D boss fights universally. You're playing Hollow Knight Silksong, great game. Of course it has influences from Touhou in its boss design, but you know what's lacking? What's obviously not that strong? The stage design. So now we're going to do something rare for a Touhou review and focus on the stages instead of the bosses. And as we go, I'll point out a lot of the really strong aesthetic choices that I love. So starting off stage 1, typical Touhou stage, not much to say here. Aesthetically though, I love the way they draw the bullets. They have a real dimension to them, and then the outlines are nice and clear for visibility, but they also have this sort of pencil sort of look. It fits in with the Touhou aesthetic so well, while also elevating the production. So then stage 2, again, aesthetically, extremely strong choices. I love the darker graveyard type of theme they're going with, especially the black bullets with the red saturated outlines. Level design wise though, a thing I'm noticing is that a lot of these enemies tend to stay in the back of the screen. They don't drop down past about the halfway mark, and I think that is what leads to Touhou having a lot of reading and reactability. It's because the enemies are always within a reactable distance.
You trying to damage my pretty face?
Alrighty, and stage 3, this will look familiar because it's based off of the forest stage from Imperishable Night. And just quickly on the topic of FDF3 being a remake of Imperishable Night, like I mentioned before, Touhou design is so general that if you change the enemy layouts, the boss fights, the aesthetics, you've just made another Touhou game. So I don't think remake quite fits in this context. So anyway, you'll recognize the premise of the forest from Imperishable Night, but I really like how they build upon it, especially when they introduce actual ground that enemies occupy. Another issue with Touhou stage design that I've noticed is that a lot of these popcorn rush waves will introduce the idea of tap dodging, which is really great, but it's almost like a tutorial rather than a true bit of stage design, because you want to mix in variations and overlapping elements over the top, because otherwise you're just doing the static tap dodge. And then when you get to the grounded bunkers, that's really cool as a concept, but it's far too generous with the cancels. That's one reason why the Hall of Hell is particularly amazing, is because it's very sparing with the cancels, and so it allows those bunkers to start to snowball and overlap and really pressure you to kill them. Whereas here, because you have so many opportunities to cancel, you're not really particularly... And then we get to the flying platforms, which I think is the most interesting bit of stage design in the game. But again, they're too afraid to assert themselves. So the bow archers are pretty relaxed and chill, and it's mostly just a question of flying through the little trails and everything. Whereas if you look at the zippers in DOJ, I think that's a much stronger example, because if you're not pushing your way through, you're going to get crushed. And the rest of the game's stage design continues all of these trends. The suggestion is there, but not the execution. Though visually, set piece wise, bullet pattern wise, stage design wise, character design wise, this game is killing it, which is why I award it Best Art Direction for its superlative. And that brings me to a general trend that I think is kind of funny, but also surprisingly true to a consistent degree, which is the better the game's graphics, the easier it is. The game's graphics, the more difficult it is. And why I think this happens is because if the game has beautiful, lush graphics, the developers have this inborn sense of trying to attract a larger audience, and so the difficulty is a barrier to that. The difficulty needs to be turned down. Whereas if the game kind of has like janky graphics, it needs to make up for that in some way. So it's like, I'll be hard as hell. That's how I'll make up for it. And so that's how you get this really funny dichotomy where Touhou 20 looks like AI generated and it's hard as hell, and then FDF3 looks beautiful and it's like baby mode. Oh man, you just can't win. You cannot win in this world. So in regards to improving FDF3's disappointing difficulty, they could begin by beefing up the patterns and introducing more routing into the stage design, which I think they did a bit with the new Ultra difficulty, but there are some underlying issues just system-wise that I think need to be addressed. The first one being this absurdly generous death bomb window. A death bomb, for those not familiar with the mechanic, is the idea that right after you're hit by a bullet, those few frames during your death, if you hit the bomb button, this will save you from the hit. And where this comes from is a technique in arcade bullet hell where you have to press the bomb button before the bullet hits you. But the strategy is that, well, if you have time to press the bomb button, then you probably have time to dodge it. And so when you first begin using bombs and shmups, you'll notice that newer players like bomb at the slightest bit of pressure, whereas ultra experienced veteran players just like almost never bomb. But the idea is that if you're really good at understanding the situation, then you'll know at the last moment this is undodgeable and you'll hit that bomb button. And so it's a very powerful skill that you hone with lots of experience to recognize when it's a true checkmate, when it isn't a true checkmate, and being able to distinguish that obviously preserves your life, but also preserves your precious bomb resources. Danbo has a great term for this, which is bomb sense. It's this instinctual understanding when it's right to bomb and when it isn't right to bomb. But what happens in arcade shmups is, in a technical sense, there are situations where you basically hit that bomb button on the frame or maybe right before that bullet hits you. Maybe the input gets munched and it was actually the game's fault. So Touhou introduced, I think, this great concept of this leniency window to train this skill and also help mitigate these types of situations. But what's happened over time is that death bombs have become a part of the Touhou lexicon and have now become a mechanic unto itself, where it's not there in that original sense of distinguishing very minute checkmate situations, and instead it's become this sort of parry type of mechanic where you get hit by something and the window is so large and generous, especially in FDF3, it's fully reactable. So now when you're getting hit by bullets in FDF3, and I'm not like an amazing death bomber, you can just parry that with your bomb basically. And that undermines, I think, this whole risk reward of to bomb or not to bomb. It's such a cool, strong, but very subtle aspect of shmup design. But if you just make the bomb a parry, all of that's gone. And on that note of the bomb, another big issue that it's very easy to see is the game is way too generous with resources. This is a general trend that we're seeing across all of gaming, but I think FDF3 pushes into the territory of absurdity. And what's interesting is that the developers seem to be aware of this, of course, because if you go into the setup before you play the difficulty mode, you have the options, and I always, skip the dialogue and all that. But if you look, there's also difficulty sliders. Yay! Doom: The Dark Ages won its Game of the Year Accessibility Award for its sliders, which I think is hilariously ironic. But yes, welcome to the era of the sliders. And so if you go down, you can change how generous the resources are and that type of thing. And what's really frustrating about this is obviously the developer should just create these parameters as part of the difficulty design. I really do not like this idea that you have the difficulty, the patterns, the levels, and then you have the bombs and the resources, and they're like this separate category from them that's modifiable. No. The resources need to be part of the level design. They need to be balanced in the levels. They need to interact with the levels. They can't just be this slider that you modify. And the super players, yes, they can go for their no miss, no bomb challenges, and that's awesome. But the average player should be able to utilize the resource system and still feel like that this is a valid clear. But now, because they've decided, oh, let's snow you with resources and then just have you modify the slider, ironically, that leaves you just no miss, no bomb now, because using the built-in resources is a joke. Stop. Stop, Touhou. And the thing about Touhou that's scary is that once a tradition begins, it's just, now we're going to do this forever. These have always been a part of Touhou, don't you remember? So you got to stop them now. No. Especially because Touhou is, like it or hate it, one of the last bastions of fundamental bullet hell. We're losing the arcade bullet hell by the day. It's so slim. So Touhou, you've got to hang in there. You can't be going down this rabbit hole. No AI backgrounds, no difficulty sliders. Keep it real. So final thoughts on FDF3. Secret Autobomb and resource snowing aside, this is a really solid, fundamental, bullet hell Touhou experience. And I really like the direction this team is going aesthetically, especially because Touhou is such an aesthetic series that is really core to its identity. That is why it is a global phenomenon.
But with one big thing that sets it apart from the rest of the genre. Instead of having little spaceships and aliens and robots and stuff like you do normally, instead, Touhou has all these little anime girls with diapers on their heads. And that one key difference, to a truly baffling number of people, makes this series f***ing amazing for some reason.
Especially that handcrafted homebrew feel. So Zun taking this direction of using AI and stuff like that, I think that's a real misstep, just understanding Touhou's underlying appeal. So if you're going to start taking Touhou to the next level, I think the FDF3 team have the right idea. The next game I have a massive soft spot for, despite it being clearly a mess, which is NeverAwake Flashback. So if you look on the store page, it's listed as a roguelite twin-stick shooter. Two genres I'm not a huge fan of, but luckily it's neither a roguelite nor a twin-stick shooter, so awesome. Okay, what is this game then? I would describe NeverAwake Flashback as an omnidirectional shmup in denial. That's clearly what it's going for. It's heavily influenced by Death Smiles, you can tell, but the developer's like, oh no, it's totally a roguelite. No, it's totally a twin stick. But nothing about its design seems interested in either of those genres, which is why I think everyone else on the planet is annoyed, but I find quite refreshing. So let's start with the whole roguelite structure. So this game isn't really roguelite, and it's not just me. Some annoyed roguelite fans have pointed this out as well, because it's not actually randomized. What it is that when you open the menu, you have this initial seed system, and so when you put in the seeds, that creates a randomized stage order, but the randomized stage order is fixed to the seed. So if you put in ZZZ, for example, you'll always get the same ultra mega black label difficulty seed.
Clear. 10110, sir.
And so what I think is cool about that, and why I like this, is because it's placing static routes as the default, and then you have to do the shuffling for the various stage orders. Whereas with most roguelites, you just have to accept their shuffle, and then if you want a particular shuffle, you have to like go out of your way to put in the seed, which may sound like the exact same thing, but there is a difference in emphasis. The game is emphasizing static orders rather than emphasizing the shuffle. It's like when you do save states for Psycho games so you can get the correct stage order that you want to play, but that just brings up the obvious issue, which is, okay, but why not just allow the player to select the stage order to begin with? Especially because this game is interacting with rank, and the rank system is no joke. It's not one of those, oh, maybe it might have some type of effect type of rank systems. Oh no. When you play at like level 5 rank, for example, it feels like Death Smiles level 1 or 2 rank. Then when you play at max rank, it goes mega black label on your ass. It has a real meaningful impact. So then why not just let the players choose the stage order with the rank? Clearly that is the solution. It's just one that's not available to you underneath the roguelite paradigm. And so that's why I think we get into this awkward middle ground. It's a middle ground I would prefer over going full roguelite, but at the same time it would be better just to stay classic, baby. It's alright, NeverAwake. You don't have to fit in with the trends, especially because this structure really screws up the game's scoring system, because it seems like in gameplay, in design, the scoring system is pretty awesome and interesting, but how do you track this? Because if you're having all these different shuffled seeds, then the leaderboard split would be unbelievable. If you think Night Striker leaderboard split would be complicated, this would be insane, because rank is part of the seed, and how the rank and stage order are going to overlap and affect each other in combination with scoring is a mystery that no one on this planet knows, because no one on the planet plays this game. There's no footage of someone even doing a high rank clear. And I think this structure is the problem, because even if you get into the game's scoring system, you'd have to get the players to all agree to play the same route, which goes back to just make it static, man. It works so much better. And the part is, even if you find a seed that you're really interested in playing, which I have, there's no training options. There's no stage select. There's no boss practice. The game is actually difficult, and so you're just back to manually grinding out full runs. None of this works. Okay, that's the structure of the game. Clearly, it's not winning a superlative. So what about NeverAwake do I have such a soft spot for? Well, something about Twinsticks that I find myself often asking, sorry Twinstick fans, is what is the point of aiming in this genre? Because if aiming is supposed to be a really skill-based experience, which it would have to be, right, since it's such a core mechanic of this genre, then why not make an FPS? FPS aiming has far more dimension and depth. For example, in Devil Daggers, those giant centipedes that undulate, where you need to run across their body and fire underneath their body as they move. You simply cannot have that happen in a twin stick because the Z-axis adds so much inherent complexity, and in a good way. So twin sticks often try to come up with ways to make their aiming meaningful, and one of the big ones is just have a bunch of popcorn-ish type of enemies rush the player physically with their bodies. Because if you use a lot of bullets, the aiming system is useless. You don't shoot down projectiles. And then if you use a lot of bigger elite enemies, aiming is so obvious, like, oh, just put the cursor on the big enemy. Wow, great skill. So what ends up happening is that if you start taking a twin stick into a bullet hell, death smiles type of direction, I think the developer begins to realize, wait a minute, the aiming is much more of a burden than an asset to this design. So why don't I just make the aiming proximity based? That way you can use your movement rather than this whole separate system to select your targets. And when you do that, when you combine together the target selection with the player's position, what does this become? It becomes a shmup. So in this cool, ridiculous, backwards way, NeverAwake's auto-aiming system becomes an omnidirectional shmup. And then he puts that on as the default. Put down the mouse, my friend, and break out the arcade stick. And what impressed me the most about the auto-aiming system of Flashback is how natural it feels. When you're playing this game and everything's working as it should, which is most of the time, it feels so much like you're playing Death Smiles, especially because you have this little option guy who moves like a Death Smiles option and blocks bullets like a Death Smiles option. And at low rank, it seems a little OP, but as you get into the higher ranks and you start to get more just insane bullet walls, no,
you need this.
And another thing I love is that the game is not afraid to push you around the screen and really bring in a lot of robust level design where you need to get yourself through really narrow passages or through crazy environmental obstacles. You need to sometimes like literally push blocks out of the way. And then one of my favorite ones is in the mouth, where you have to navigate your way through a mouth that's shutting and closing. And since it's omnidirectional, shifts in the scroll feel extremely natural. And that's one of my favorite things about omnidirectional shmups and why I think Death Smiles like basically is one, is because in Omni, the home base positioning wise is the center of the screen rather than near like the back third. And the level design and enemy design respond to this. For example, there's a stage with this floating crystal in the center, and you use the floating crystal as active cover. But since it's omnidirectional, you move up to the left, to the right, like in all directions around this crystal. And then enemy design wise, a lot of the enemies play with this dynamic. Like there's these syringes that charge you, and you need to get up and around the sides of the syringes to damage them. Same thing with these arms. You need to get up and over and hit them in the elbow. Otherwise, the hands block the bullets. And then there are these turtles that come in and they have this spread shot that you basically need to block with your option. But then they fire this concentrated machine gun that goes through your option, but it's narrow. And so for those, you got to get to their weak sides to hit them. And point blanking is really emphasized, especially because the auto aim really responds to proximity. So if you want to make sure you're damaging something, get your ass close to it.
The auto aim creates positioning.
And this is something that twin sticks just really struggle with, because in a twin stick, your movement and your shooting are disjointed from one another, right? And so oftentimes you can just stand in one spot and shoot everything from that one spot because you can fire all around yourself. And the auto aim should technically be the same thing, but since it is unreliable in its target selection at longer distances, it kind of creates that same blind fire effect that you get in Call of Duty, where if you're running and shooting at the same time, your accuracy is naturally lower unless you go into like dedicated aim. And FPS do this to create a sense of commitment to shooting. That way you're not just running and shooting and circle strafing all the time. That makes sense. And the auto aim system in this game basically functions that same way. I think it would be better, though, if this was a formal part of the auto aim. That's kind of the problem here, where now when you're playing NeverAwake with its auto aim, you can blame the game for misfiring at the wrong targets because it's supposed to be reading your mind and all that. But if it was formally made part of the auto aiming system called blind fire, the player would understand, oh, this is an intended limitation. The gold standard for this type of system, of course, is Ketsui. Now, Ketsui isn't omnidirectional, but it has this same system between unlocked and locked fire. And you can even move in and out of the locked range once you acquire the initial lock. That's where this auto aim system could go. It's not there yet, but it feels like, oh, you're on to something here, Flashback. Ironically, because the auto-aiming system has these natural limitations that I don't think are totally intended. But that's how a lot of great mechanics begin, by the way, is that the developers realize, okay, no, this is just a limitation. Let's make it formally part of the game. So I would love to see if there's a follow-up to Flashback, him just fully embracing this auto-aiming system as a built-in aspect of the game's design, and then just dropping the free aim. Balance the stages around the concept. Now we're cooking.
Oh, yeah.
So the auto aim is awesome, but that's not the only sauce Flashback has. It has another really innovative idea that the more I think about it, the more I'm digging it. And it's the way it does its looping stages. So I'll try to explain this, and then I'll try to explain why this is really cool. So the way it works is that Flashback has these short little stages that go in a loop while you auto-scroll. And the way that you exit the loop is by killing enough enemies and collecting these blue flame, we'll call it. And then once you get 100% of the blue flame, the stage advances. And so if you play passively and don't attack the enemies, you'll just stay in this loop over and over. I've not tested how long it goes on, but I know it goes on for at least 3 loops. I'm assuming it'll just keep going, but yeah, so that's the way it works. And on paper, it sounds kind of absurd, but the more you analyze it, I think it's really onto something here. Let me explain why. So if we look at your traditional arena twin stick, like Geometry Wars, what is the issue every single twin stick runs up against? It's circle strafing, because in a twin stick, you're able to move, fire, and aim all at the same time. And so that allows you to basically be constantly at an evasive angle while also attacking the enemies pursuing you. And so it is the mission of every single twin stick to attempt to overcome the circle strafe. And so Sektori, another game I'll talk a little bit about more later, thought, okay, well, one thing you could do is you could just shift the stage around so that as you're doing the circle strafe, there'll be shifts in the stages, and that will prevent the circle strafe. What I think happened is that this temporarily disrupts the circle strafe, but only during the period where you need to realign to the new stage configuration. And then once you are realigned, essentially the circle strafe continues. It's just in a new formation. It's like water. You can change the container, but you cannot change its nature. And so what Flashback does is embrace it by turning the circle strafe into an auto scroll. And so if you look at a zoomed out perspective of what the stage would look like, it's a tunnel rather than an open area. And since it's omnidirectional, the tunnel can be all kinds of different shapes, and it's perfectly fine. What's important is by making the strafe constant, it zeroes it out.
This is one of the most fundamental laws of physics. If you're moving at a constant speed, you're not aware of that movement.
The auto scroll is the strafe, and then the camera perspective is the box. So you're always constantly inside a moving box that the enemies can anticipate and respond to. And so that is how you can have both a loop and level design together. The secret sauce is the auto-scroll, which is why in manually scrolling shmups like Fantasy Zone, it is still possible
to circle strafe.
The auto-scroll enforces commitment.
Even though you don't feel it.
So that's pretty cool. But let's not forget about the blue flames, because the question of every action game is, how do you motivate the player to engage with the enemy?
I love the smell of napalm in the morning. Smells like victory.
But what if you have a game like Sektori, where carving out your own little corner also works pretty well? The developer needs to motivate you somehow. And with a Western game like Sektori, the answer is almost always power. That is how we're going to motivate the player. We're going to give you more power if you engage in the game. That way, when you get to the bosses, those are easier, and get to the later stages, those are easier. And so the entire game's level design, enemy design becomes regulating the player's power curve. It works in this brute force sense, because if you're not engaging in the power curve, eventually the enemies are just going to out DPS you and you're going to get crushed underneath it. So it does function, but I don't think it's that elegant, especially because it makes the early game a tedious chore. Whereas if you look at something like Pac-Man, how do you advance through the stages? By collecting the dots. Do the dots power you up? No, they do not. Pac-Man is a static creature. He begins the game as strong as he is at the end. And what's actually really cool about Pac-Man is there is power-up decay. The little power pellets that you eat that turn the ghosts blue, those actually decrease in power over time rather than increasing in power. And I've been thinking a lot lately about the importance of power decay in the late game, but we'll save that for another video. So returning to Flashback, the blue flames are like power pellets. They make you engage with the enemies, but they do not power you up. Progression in this game is not dependent on powering up. Now, the developer massively with powering up the little items that you get in between the stages. Don't do that. But this stage advance structure, I think, is really cool. So my final thoughts on NeverAwake Flashback are a bit complicated, because I think it has a really strong sense of game design inside the stages when you're actually playing it. It's just this structure is completely misguided. And funnily enough, I took a look at the original NeverAwake just in footage, and it seems to have more of a traditional structure, so a lot of my critiques may be more similar to that game. But at the same time, looking at the gameplay footage of the original NeverAwake versus Flashback, Flashback to me seems to have just better core gameplay. So just from a gut level, I think Flashback is more interesting. It's just too experimental. It seems unfinished, like there's a puzzle piece of an amazing game, and this game has the pieces, but they're in the wrong spots, right? It's like this puzzle that if you just took all the pieces apart and then rearranged them correctly, it would be an amazing game. But as it is right now, it's just missing too much of the core stuff, like stage practice, boss select, leaderboards, just like real basic stuff to be a home run. But at the same time, I love its vibe. I love what it's going for. The auto aim mechanic wins the superlative of the most accidentally awesome mechanic. And I would love to see what this guy comes up with for his next game. I'm hoping it fully embraces its Omni Shmup destiny and also drops the iframe dash. That sucks. And now for a short interlude where I give my impression of Sektori. This is an impression, not a full formal review, because 1, I just don't want to play this game anymore. 2, the time pressures of this video dealing with this game already caused extra delays, and then continuing to deal with it, as I'll talk about here shortly, would take forever. So this video would be like a week late or something if I kept trying to finish reviewing Sektori. And 3, because Sektori is part of a much bigger conversation that I'm going to be tackling this year anyway. So I think it's beyond the scope of this video, but I'll give a little impression of what I think so far. But this is off the record, not admissible in court. So as a twin stick, I think Sektori is a step back from from Nex Machina. And I kind of alluded to this during the NeverAwake review, but this evolving stage structure sounds cool in theory, but in practice, it just creates temporary delays before you go back to the same sort of circle strafing, constant evasive movement meta, because it's still just way too open, and the enemy spawns are too telegraphed, too reactable, and it seems like the only answer the developer has is a lot of RNG, a ton of power restriction with 2 progression systems, and then a heavy reliance on an auto-charging iframe bomb dash, and sheer volume.
Body count.
Which isn't unique. Most arena twin-stick shooters have this problem, but Nex Machina actually had a better idea, because rather than making the stages one big open encounter, it breaks up the encounters into rooms, essentially, and these rooms allow for more specific level design and also allow the developers to account for player disadvantage, because when you jump from one room to another, the enemies know where you're going to land and they're prepared. And so it creates a much more consistent sense of level design than just having a big shifting arena. And then on top of that, Nex Machina also has the human hostage system, which acts like Pac-Man and creates a sense of structure for each encounter that isn't just the enemies themselves. And then if you want to add RNG into this process, you can just randomize what's in the rooms themselves, which some roguelikes do, like Enter the Gungeon or Star of Providence does as well. And so as I'm talking, it's sounding like, oh, this is a proper review, okay. So as a twin stick, Nex Machina is the better game. But just leaving the review at that analysis, to me, feels like writing up Al Capone for tax evasion. Like, okay, it technically works, but nobody gives a shit. Because if I told the people who are really into Sektori, oh yeah, the structure of the encounters in Sektori is a mess and a step back from Nex Machina, the response would be, so? Because that's not the appeal of this game. I have the exact same issue with Absalom, and when I started playing Absalom and thinking about reviewing it, I was like, oh yeah, I can clearly point out how this is such a regression back from Streets of Rage 4 in terms of beat-em-up design.
Even the IGN review of Absalom noticed this.
But what was the response?
So?
Old man, you've missed the point. The point of these games is not their little arcade influences, it's the roguelite structure. That is the appeal. You can see article after article about Absalom saying this outright. Beat-em-ups should become roguelites. And so, for me as a critic, I'm kind of unarmed right now.
He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue.
Because I don't have a lot of background with roguelite design, I can't tell you necessarily at the moment what its strengths are. I can definitely see the weaknesses in terms of balance and skill progression, but I think to tackle this subject properly, I'm going to spend a good amount of time this year familiarizing myself with roguelikes, roguelites, that whole sector of design, because clearly it is on a crash course with the arcade genres. Especially with roguelites, they see the arcade genres as a suitable host to infest their design.
I'm one of the Zerg now, and I like what I am.
So, for now, Sektori escapes the eye of Sauron, but one of my big goals this year is investigating this rogue stuff. And while we're here in the intermission, I'll quickly shout out Lilac 0 as another contestant, because I reviewed it earlier this year and really liked it a lot, and then played it at...
And that should be it. There's one last in Master, but Master...
And so if I was really shameless, I would do the sitcom thing of just showing clips from that review in this video. I love that it's just so openly inspired by Zero Ranger as well. I really like when indie games just wear their influences on their sleeves, but then also do something unique and interesting. And we get kind of this cool little zero-core subgenre because of it. And we might see more indie Western shmups in this subgenre because it's so compelling. And I think a great entry point into the genre for people who don't typically play bullet hell. I love this game. It's easily in my contender list for Shmup of the Year so far. I found this incredibly refreshing, and it's just one of those great reminders of how immortal
this genre is. Just when you think you know everything that's coming out and what's being worked on, a huge sleeper like this appears out of nowhere and just nails it.
I want to begin this next review with a story. So when Treasure were making Sin and Punishment 2 Star Successor on the Wii, they were making the game's balance around the GameCube controller. And while they were doing the development, they thought, okay, this is going to be a really tough, challenging game. And in the previous Sin and Punishment, Nintendo kept telling them, make it easier, it's way too hard. So when they sent over Star Successor to Nintendo, they're like, okay, we're going to get the old it's too difficult talk. And then the Nintendo team came back and said, why is the game so easy? And the Treasure developers were shocked. Like, what? What do you mean? And it turns out the reason why the Nintendo developers thought Sin and Punishment 2 during development was so easy is because they were using the Wiimote, whereas the dev team was using the GameCube controller. So all of the patterns were balanced around the GameCube controller, and the Wiimote is just OP as hell and destroying all of the patterns. So they had to go back and rebalance all of the game to take account for the power of the Wiimote. They said they tried to make both the GameCube and Nintendo Wiimote balance each other out equally, but if we're being honest, of course the Wiimote is way more powerful than the controller because of that unlocked cursor, because your cursor speed can be insanely fast depending on your reactions and your reflexes, and that's a motion-controlled Wiimote. Now let me introduce you to the ultimate foe of every gallery shooter. Because how do you balance this son? If we go back to the arcade era of gallery shooters, they didn't have this problem because they only had the arcade stick available. And so what they did is they split the stick's function. It either needs to be moving or aiming, but it can't be doing both simultaneously. And by splitting that function, what they created is a disjoint between attacking and positioning, which in my opinion is a good thing, because in that disjoint is where you insert player skill. And the skill is not just the technical aspect of juggling the two mechanics, though that is a part of it, but it's also the preemptive risk calculation you have to constantly make of where should I move and also when should I attack, when should I stop attacking. If we want a throwback, we can revisit the distinction between Resident Evil 4 OG and the remake, and you can definitely see this in the Mercs mode, where in OG you're constantly asking yourself, do I go in? Do I turn around and run? Do I fire? Especially in the cabin where space is constrained. Shout out to Blader's video. But in the remake, there's no decision. Just do all of them. Move, shoot, and aim all together. That's the danger of too much mechanical freedom. You lose the natural consequences of limitation. And so in the place of the natural consequences, you just need the zombies to become football players and tackle. Leon! So then you need to change the enemy design. But it turns out, okay, if you have all these fast running enemies, the cabin is too small to support that. So let's make the cabin bigger and then add places where you can run around.
Where are you going, Leon?
So you've changed the player mechanics, which then needs to change the enemy design, which then needs to change the level design. That's why gallery shooters don't exist. And everything is a twin stick. It's because no one values the idea of limiting the player's mechanics to begin with. And I say all this not to single out Silver Bullet, because I don't think Treasure quite solved this issue either, but to bring up what I think is a very core issue with the contemporary gallery shooter that I don't think is likely to be discussed elsewhere. Because if you look at the performance of the mouse, it is as close as we get to a perfect gaming tool. If you're playing any type of professional game in which a mouse can be used, you will use that mouse. From the best of my knowledge, right? It is unbelievably fast and accurate. I think the only limitation to the mouse that we often see is human limitation of how good can you get with the damn thing. And you Zoomer kids are getting real damn good with these mice. So when you look at something like a gallery shooter and its history of moving this giant cursor with this digital arcade stick,
they are not compatible
to exist in the same balance. It's like bringing a sledgehammer to a thumb wrestling contest. Too easy.
Ow!
you! You pervert!
I'll show you side by side me playing Silver Bullet on arcade stick and me playing Silver Bullet with the mouse. And just for context, I am a much more expert arcade stick player than I am a mouse user. I'm like scrubby in terms of like mouse control and stuff. And yet, when you see them side by side, it's not remotely comparable. I am annihilating this game with the mouse. So what's the solution? First off, I don't think you can just hard eliminate the mouse, though I do respect that if you go ahead and do it. But the issue is that in today's context, that would just feel like you didn't finish developing the game rather than it being a specific artistic choice. And I think even if you explained it like on your Steam page, there's no mouse support because this is a specific artistic choice. Problem is, developers abuse that excuse a little too much. Earthion. Okay, I'm kidding. Anyway, the better approach, I think, is to look at our hero and champion, Guange, because Guange is essentially a gallery shooter, but you never think about it that way because the Shiki mechanic is not a crosshair. It is an official mechanic that's meant to be balanced and respected. The crosshair of the gallery shooter is exactly like that, but since on the surface it looks like a crosshair that you see in an FPS or in a twin stick, no one treats it as a distinctive gameplay balance mechanic, but that's exactly what it is. And so even with something like GoldenEye, where it's clearly balanced for the janky N64 analog stick, immediately there's going to be mods to add mouse aim and stuff like that, and you can destroy GoldenEye, but no one says this about Guange, and it's because it's contextualized within the mechanics of the game. I think gallery shooters need to embrace this idea. So rather than having some crosshair just hanging out on the screen, the gallery shooter should try to incorporate it more officially into the mechanics of the game so that the players playing understand, oh, the cursor speed is balanced into the enemy layouts. It's balanced into the boss attack patterns. It's balanced into the entire level design of the game. So I think that's the first most viable step forward. Contextualize the crosshair as a built-in game mechanic. Option 2. If you're going to be using the mouse, you need to create a very specific arrange to incorporate the mouse's performance. So you go into mouse mode and the enemies are prepared for you to target them extremely quickly. And then the enemy layouts are a lot more intense and the game is directly challenging your ability to aim with the mouse, which I think Sin and Punishment 2 ultimately does with the Wiimote. Though when you emulate it on Dolphin, I still think the mouse is a little OP. So in regards to Silver Bullet specifically, I have a lot of empathy because this is uncharted territory, but we can see the effects. For example, all of the bonus games are extremely easy, except the Tetris bonus game because that requires puzzle game thought, so I was immediately defeated by that. But all the other ones, boom, 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 suppressive fire, no problem at all. Free money, free health, free extends. By the end of my run, I was swimming in extends. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And even the stages themselves weren't really all that challenging because I could just continually lay out suppressive fire. So if you are a mouse user, the place where the game is going to start kicking you in the mouth are the bosses, because the extra aiming ability of the mouse isn't that much of an advantage on the bosses at first, until you learn to abuse that. So initially it is about the same dealing with the bosses with the extra power of the mouse, but what you end up realizing is that because you can re-aim so quickly, then macro movement becomes incredibly buffed. Because if you're playing on arcade stick, and I played this game just like you play Guange on arcade stick, because in Guange during the boss fights, your Shiki remains where you leave it when you're not firing, but during the stages it reels back in. Great design stuff there. So in Silver Bullet, your crosshair acts like the Shiki boss behavior. So when I was playing on arcade stick, you can see the way I fight the bosses, I think they're sort of balanced to be fought this way, where you're under them, you're kind of weaving through their patterns. Awesome stuff. And then when the hand comes down on the skeleton boss, for example, that kind of throws you off. You got to realign and then pushing the sides. The game is really good when you're on arcade stick at getting you to juggle between moving and aiming, and that is what we want to see in a gallery shooter. But with the mouse, not a problem. You can macro all the way away from the boss and then instantly get that cursor right back on him. Same thing with the bouncing ball boss, where it has those lasers and you have to stay underneath the ball, and then if you shoot the parts of the ball, then they have little suicide bullets. On arcade stick, that's quite a juggle because you got to move, you got to re-aim, and then you've got to dodge the bullets. And so that spinning nature of the ball makes it
tricky to do on stick.
But on mouse, you're just like, do, walking under. I'll just shoot at the top of the ball because that's the safest spot. No problem. And then you get to the final boss, same thing. It's got this silver gun type of pattern coming down. You got to weave in between them. You're like, oh, and you got to get the cursor, move the cursor. Great stuff. And then on mouse, you can watch your character and just slightly adjust the cursor with your peripheral vision. So to me, it feels like it was primarily balanced around arcade stick initially, at least when it comes to the bosses, especially because the developer gives you all these tools that are not at all necessary when you have mouse aiming. For example, you have this running dash that not only has great macro movement, but also physically attacks things on the foreground, which makes sense if you're on stick and your cursor is all the way up at the top of the screen, and it's going to take a bunch of time to get the cursor down to fire at stuff on the plane and then bring it back up. So it makes sense to give the player some sort of physical attack to compensate here. But with the mouse, you can just bring the mouse down and fire at things. And this would actually make the mouse control a lot more interesting if the game constantly made you move up and down, up and down, up and down, and didn't have a physical defense against things on the foreground. But since you have both, what ends up happening is you just constantly lay out suppressive fire, and then if something is next to you, you just physically attack it while maintaining your aim. It's way too powerful of a combo. You have the game constantly under control throughout the stages, pretty much all the way through to the end. The final stage ramps things up and makes you juggle a little bit more, and that's my favorite stage, by the way. But for the most part, if you just use this strategy, the game doesn't have much of an answer. And then on top of that, you're going to give the player an auto-recharging bomb attack with the dog, which is cute and everything. But I really strongly recommend you make that a limited resource, because once you realize, wait a second, this sucker recharges, then the most significant aspect of the game's difficulty, the boss fights, really start to have trouble, because whenever you get slightly cornered or slightly threatened, you just fire off that dog, get the iframes, clear yourself a little pathway, and you're perfectly safe. And then, if the dog is unavailable, your cursor is busy, you can't use your physical attack because you're trapped by bullets, you've got the parry. Do not have this mechanic. Delete it immediately, because whatever checkmate situations tend to come up, they are often thwarted by the parry on top of all of the other player tools. And so when you add all of these ingredients together, the powerful mouse control, the recharging bow, the parry, the physically attacking dash, the survival difficulty of this game is greatly reduced. Despite having solid boss fights and fun stages, the player is too powerful. And then we bring in the bonus games. All right, before we talk about the bonus games, I want to talk about what I think is the primary strength of Silver Bullet, because in that context, the bonus games make some sense, but I don't think it's a good idea. So the primary strength of Silver Bullet is this game's scoring. This game has a really fun, engaging scoring system, and if you're playing for score, then all of the movement with the mouse makes more sense. Being able to fire the dog to create items makes more sense, and the bonus games make a little bit more sense. With all of that being said though, the bonus games cause some problems. The first issue is what I talked about in The Deepest Games Are Dumb, where if a game can be perfected, then it becomes static. The first two bonus games are very easy to perfect, so they basically shouldn't exist. They don't have any meaningful impact beyond maybe your first playthrough or two. And then even some of the later ones, like the UFOs, the only counter force to the UFOs challenge is the need to pick up the scoring items. But if you go ahead and just ignore the scoring items, that one is easy to perfect as well. So that's the first issue. They're not that challenging in themselves. And then the second issue is that a lot of them don't capitalize on the movement to shooting disjoint. You can pretty much stand in one location and fire away in a lot of situations. And again, the only movement incentive is picking up scoring items, which brings us to the third problem, which is that it's a self-feeding meta where scoring constantly rewards survival, especially with the shop system. And so what ends up happening is that if you get good at these bonus games, which have no consequences, by the way, if you fail them, you don't lose and extend. And not gaining resources is not a consequence. And so what this means in terms of the survival difficulty, which is already having problems, is that you can use these bonus games as a crutch to paper over the core difficulty of the stages. And so if you're having trouble in the last stage, for example, well, if you just get really good at these consequence-free bonus games, you can stock up on the resources to where you don't need to really practice the last stage all that much. So that's the catch-22 of this bonus stuff and why I think arcade games ended up phasing them out. Because if they're meaningless, like breaking the car in Street Fighter 2, then they're just a waste of time. But if they're meaningful and they give you resources or score, then that starts to cut away at the core stage design, especially because they don't have consequences and they don't have the full meta of the game. And so with this bonus stuff, I feel like they would be better included in like a separate mode, because as it stands right now, it feels like this odd parallel game that stands alongside the main game that's too meaningful to ignore outright, but causes conflict with the main stages. My favorite thing that the developer did is that he took the best bonus stage, the Tetris one, and he turned it into its own official mode with its own leaderboard. That is really cool. It's a shame there isn't a replay system, because I am genuinely curious how this game plays, and I'm going to award the superlative of best game within a game to this Tetris mode, because it is interesting and I can see people really getting into it in its own right. I think that is a better route to go rather than trying to incorporate them into the main gameplay. So, final thoughts on Silver Bullet. Like Space Moth, I really enjoy playing this game, and I think it has a nice, charming feel that I have a soft spot for. But like Space Moth as well, the difficulty is too gentle. Just overall, the level design finally kicks in peak form in the graveyard, and I think that stage is clearly the best stage of the game. It has all of the elements I want to see in a gallery shooter. It's forcing you to move, it's forcing you to juggle targets, it's got stuff down in the foreground challenging you, it's got stuff all the way at the top of the screen. Even with the mouse, you're like wah 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 wah, having to go everywhere. And so it's awesome, but it's also kind of bittersweet, because in the back of my head I'm thinking, okay, you have this in your sleeve. You are capable of doing this, so inject this energy through the rest of the stages. And if I had my way, there would be an additional mode added that removes mouse support, that really beefs up the stage design and enemy aggression, like Stage 5, but even further, that beefs up the bosses, think doubling the difficulty, and then removes the bonus stages. And really tamps down on the item shop. Makes stuff expensive as hell, like Master Ninja. So yeah, that's Silver Bullet. It's cool to see a new gallery shooter, and I had a ton of fun playing it. It's just a little too kind. And finally, we have arrived at the last game. And we're ending it off with a game that I actually am familiar with, Emerald Blue. Now, as a bit of a background, I actually gave some feedback to the developers of Emerald Blue really early on, like when they were working on Stage 1. And so the amount of development that has occurred between my initial feedback and now is impressive, and I think this team has a ton of talent. They've heard from me before. This can be like a second bit of feedback. So the strengths of Emerald Blue is definitely its sense of fundamentals. The stage design of the game is great. It has that cave feel, which is so hard to capture, but I think they do an impressive job. And the pace, this is density, baby. This game does not stop from beginning to end, which I think is really cool. I'll have some feedback on some additional ideas, but the general sense of pace, the general flow, all of it is fantastic. And remember in the Touhou feedback where I noticed all the Touhou enemies go back? In Emerald Blue, everything comes forward, straight at your ass, cave style. You can't slide by the enemies here. I tried on the last stage to go up and around this final group and they just rammed my ass, which I think is really cool. Also, the sword mechanic worked out very well because when we were first talking about what this sword mechanic could be, I remember it being a bit more eccentric, so I'm glad it came together in a really coherent way. The way it works is that the sword comes out, and when the sword hits an enemy, it either does a ton of damage to it, you know, point blanking style and all that, or it poisons it or puts a spell on it or whatever it is, and it damages the enemy at a slower rate, and you can move around and focus on other targets. It's a play on the Ketsui lock-on system, and I think it's one of the better ones that I've seen because it feels really natural. Though the first bit of critique I have is that this needs to be visually communicated a lot more, because this concept of stabbing them and poisoning them, it's cool once you know that happens, but if a new player just buys the game and plays it, I doubt they will pick up on this even happening. This needs to be visually telegraphed in some really clear way. The Ketsui lock-on, it's so distinct, you can pick it out from a pile of cabinets all the way across the room. You need something like that with the poison mechanic. You need some sort of real visual effect, and then you need an iconic, really easy to distinguish sound effect so that people know what's happening. Another thing is the range of the sword. I feel like the range of the sword is a little too all or nothing, because if you go to the back of the screen with Ketsui, you'll find that the shot goes about 2/3 of the way. Obviously, you have to be closer to lock on, but then once you're locked on in Ketsui, you can maneuver around. That's the real magic, where this sword kind of forces you to be in just a few locations. And so what ends up happening is that from run to run, it starts to feel a little static because your range is so limited. So I think extending that out a little bit more, maybe rebalancing the damage. And while I'm on the subject, you need to rebalance the damage on the mid-sized enemies, because as it is now, they're basically popcorn. They need more meat. They need more screen presence, because right now you can just wipe them out instantly. And I know where this comes from because I've been there myself. It's like the last thing you want is tanky enemies. The last thing you want is to make a Euro shmup. Trust me, I know that feeling. But you also want to be able to distinguish enemy types from one another. So if you make everything have kind of the health of popcorn, then everything becomes popcorn. And that is, I think, one of the underlying issues with the feel of the game, is that you are just battering through most of the game. And I think it's the mid-sized enemies. They need a little bit more health. They need to stay alive a little longer to assert themselves. And I think that will make the game feel a bit meatier.
Stamina!
And speaking of meteor, the core enemy placement of Emerald Blue is really solid and well done, except it's missing that one ingredient, which are the set pieces. Cave has a ton of set piece moments in their game design. It's just so well integrated that you don't notice them until you think about it. Like mid-bosses, of course, that adds a ton, but also moments where the scroll will change or you'll get a unique, larger elite enemy coming in. Like at the end of Stage 2 in Ketsui, where you have those big ass helicopter things coming in and then the tanks after them. That makes Stage 2 really distinct, because basically you guys have the first part of Stage 2, but you don't have those elite encounters like the tanks, like the big helicopters, or in Stage 4 when it starts to scroll sideways and you have those little ground tank things that are making these crazy walls. And then you've got the big ass ships coming in that you have to point blank and move along with. Those are the moments that are missing in Emerald Blue, and why, even though it's really challenging and fun, it feels kind of incomplete. It's because of these moments. And you get a little bit at the end, like that tank that rams you if you don't kill it. We need more moments like this throughout all the stages. The boss fights, though, were all really good. I love how vicious the Stage 1 boss is. I think it's harder than Ketsui's until you get into the later loops, so great work on the boss fights.
Success!
But in regards to the difficulty overall, you should cap the extends because they do undermine the climax of the TLB. I'm not a strong enough player to abuse the extend system, but I've seen replays where there's just way too many extends for the more skilled players. So add in a cap like Gunvein does, where you get like, I don't know, 3 or 4 and then a shield or something, but cap those extends, because otherwise the final boss encounter for people who have scored and got a bunch of points are like, not an issue here. I have a ton of extends locked and loaded.
No contest.
All right, and now we have to talk about these bullets. Do not do flashing, strobing bullets like this, because first of all, when you get a bunch of them going, they create this strobe effect that has nothing to do with the bullet behavior, but just because of the flashing animation, you're like, whoa, whoa. You're trying to dodge shit, and you're looking off into the right corner because it's strobing. Don't do that. And then in terms of visibility, I asked Bog, he confirmed, you do not want to use flashing bullets because what happens is, visibility-wise, they pop in and out of existence, especially when they're flashing white. They're just a pure white ball, right? They don't have a lot of contrast or outline.
Since game backgrounds have a variety of values, simply making bullets brighter or darker isn't enough. Instead, use very dark and very bright colors side by side. They help each other stand out no matter what the background looks like.
Another bit of feedback on the bullets is that if you have bullets of similar shape doing different things, I think you need to use more colors.
Use distinct colors. Even though values are the most important thing, colors still matter. There are good reasons why so many games use red, pink, and purple bullets. Unlike, for example, orange bullets, they do not overlap with the other typical game elements, like explosions or gold medals.
Just to help the player visually sort what bullet is what, especially when they start overlapping with one another, you start to think, okay, which one is bending where? For example, look at the final pattern of the Stage 3 boss in Ketsui, where it has the blue and red bullets. Imagine if those were the same color, you'd be like, what the fuck? So if you have bullets that are overlapping with each other and are kind of similar shapes, I really recommend at least having 2 different bullet colors, please. So that's the bullets. Let's talk about the backgrounds. Overall, the backgrounds look fine, but they're very static. They don't have a sense of life to them. There's not parallax layers happening, so rather than having just one layer of background down there, what you want to do is you want to break the background into a series of layers and then have a parallax effect over the top of them. That's what gives it depth. And so the first stage of Futari, it seems like, oh, it's just a forest floor. But then when you look at it, you have all these different elements, like way down there in space is a far background, and then you've got the trees and stuff. It adds so much to the visual presentation of a game. The more dimension you have, the more immersive it feels. And just look through the backgrounds that Cave does. You're going to find a lot of great inspiration there. Also, background color-wise, I know green is the theme of the game, but it's going too hard on the green, where you've got the green background, the green bullets, the green crystals, and it's just too much green. So I would say for the background, try for a more contrasting color as much as you can. Light pink or orange, I don't know, but just not green on green on green, especially the final boss where it's like green on green on green on green. It's like, mother of God, visibility. The backgrounds don't need to be green too. And then on the ship itself, it needs a little more presence, like maybe give the options some more animation or add like a trail. Just make the player ship seem more lively. And before we finish, we got to talk about this menu system, because I think that you're going for kind of an arcade ROM type of thing, and then the options menu is like the dip switches. But do not do this, because instantly players think this game isn't finished. There's no menu system. And then when you finally track down the menu system, you're like, oh, this is a really bare bones menu. There's no training options. There's no nothing. Turns out there is training options, but it's in the options menu. No. Okay, so obviously you may not have the production capacity to do a really robust Mushihime-sama style menu, but what you can do, and I think you should take a look at, is the DOJ PS2 menu. It isn't fancy, but it's really aesthetic, clean, and clear. And then overall, try to make the features more polished, and for the love of God, add in Tate support. I had to put my face right up to the monitor to get the 1cc, so yeah, Tate is a must for this type of game. And so final thoughts on Emerald Blue. I think it's a really strong game in progress, and that would be my superlative, but I just don't think it's finished. And I want to distinguish this feedback from my BIRDCAGE feedback. So in BIRDCAGE, they have the material there. It needs to be revised and revamped. Whereas in Emerald Blue, the material here is solid, but you just need more material, more mid-bosses, more set pieces, fill out the stages, maybe even do the double final stage like Cave does. And this is feedback I almost never give, and I tend to make fun of it because in 99% of cases, most shmups have too much material, or the material that's there just needs to be revised. But in the case of Emerald Blue, you do actually just need to create more stuff, because I had a lot of fun playing it, but it's shorter than even a Psycho game, and Psycho has the double loop structure, so you can maybe look into that as well, but it just needs to be filled out, both in the sense of the gameplay, but also in the sense of the presentation. More layers, more things happening with the background. It's a very promising game in progress. We did it. We made it to the end of the video. 10 respect points to you for coming this far. But before we announce the top 3 winners, I want to take a quick moment to shout out Bog's new game, Caramel Action Micro, which came out during the course of this video, so it technically doesn't count. It wasn't in 2025. But I still wanted to shout it out because it's basically the embodiment of a lot of these topics I've been talking about throughout the course of these reviews, and so I highly recommend checking it out, and it's free and everything. Let's get to the winners. Number 3 is Lilac 0, which is a little odd because it wasn't featured in this video, but it did come out earlier in the year, and I covered it fully in its own review, so that's a little extra DLC if you want to go watch that. Lilac 0 is just what the world needs. A solid, well-made, fundamental shmup, an all-rounder with great influences from Zero Ranger, Crimson Clover. So Lilac 0, holding down the vertical shmups. We need a game like this every year. So I award Lilac 0 33.3 respect points. And now, number 2, Neon Inferno. I forgot to mention in the original review that its superlative is best genre blend, but it's great to talk about it right here. So the reason why Neon Inferno is up at the number 2 slot is 1, it's very ambitious. It's bringing together 2 genres that I think should just become one. Running guns with this second layer that I talked about in the review. It felt so fresh, and you can tell the developers really care about the difficulty and the structure and the feel. So it aimed high, but it also backed it up. And of course, the graphics are fantastic. Obviously, there's still
a bit to go
with the level design and the enemy design and not having a scoring system. Okay, apparently they added a scoring mode literally like an hour before I am posting this. So I have no idea how good it is, but there is one. But the base foundation is solid, and the fact that it has a really nice difficulty curve and game structure, I think brings it home. So I award Neon Inferno 55.5 respect points. Which brings us to the winner. Drumroll, please. I'm sure you've all already guessed it, but yes, the winner is Night Striker Gear. Night Striker Gear is the kind of game that sets itself apart
in the details.
Everything about this game's balance has that delicate touch where it's like if the main shot was just a little bit more homing, you could really start to abuse the system. Or if the gear system auto-recharged itself. Or if the enemy health was just a little bit higher, it would feel tanky. It's like everything is just right. And I love that the central mechanic of the game is contained inside the enemies rather than in the players. That's some OG developer right there. Like a new developer would not do that. It would be all about the player mechanics. We've seen it 1,000 times, so that is a really good sign. If I had 1 point of critique for Night Striker Gear, outside of all the issues I talked about with its release and its graphics, in terms of its actual gameplay, I think it's probably its movement speed, because it basically inherits the movement speed from Night Striker and a lot of rail shooters, and you have a lot of macro dodging. But if you look at the developers' other games like Ikaruga and Silvergun, they're based around ships with more constrained movement speed, and so you kind of can abuse the movement speed probably a little bit too much. And also the controls are a little wild to wrangle at first because it was made for this analog flight stick, so I recommend playing this on analog stick. You can play it on arcade stick, but it reminds me of playing like Moto in Garega. You gotta have a real feel for playing high-speed ships. It is doable though, but it definitely feels much better on analog stick. And you might want to mess around with the configuration in Steam and stuff because I'm quite sure it is configured for a flight stick rather than like an Xbox pad or something. But that aside, I've been having so much fun with Night Striker gear, and I'm definitely looking forward to playing it more. I think it is genuinely pushing rail shooters in the right direction, which is something I love to see arcade developers doing, rather than taking Night Striker and they're like, all right, how can I turn this into a roguelite, or how can I turn this into some other genre? I think refining already existing genres is a much more interesting and important path forward for arcade games, because the material, the wealth of design this genre has is unmatched and it's untapped. But instead, developers are often pulling from that same pool of console stuff or modern design. And so for genuinely pushing the arcade rail shooter genre forward, I award Night Striker gear 111 respect points. And so if you enjoyed this insanely massive review, please like, subscribe, tell all your friends, and support me on Patreon if you can, because there's no way I could do a project like this without Patreon support. And also I've got cool exclusive content on the Patreon, like podcasts and exclusive giant videos there as well. I just did one on ludonarrative dissonance. Adios, everyone. So thank you to the $5 and $8 patrons: 10, 11, 100, 100, Absconditis, Adam Kesey, Eternal Solitude, AJD578, Alistair Stevenson, Alberto Starna, Alex Kors, Alexander Pfeiffer, Alson, AMH, Andres, Anthony A, Pick Patrick, Arcade Hell, A Royal Guard, Arg, Arrow Viper, Au Alai, Autonamed, Axel-Rate, Bandover Tui, Baron Metzgerstein, Battle Mode, Basil Dazzle, Bo, Bellator Poeta, Ben Foster, Benjamin Chabalski, Beto Dames, BK, Blader, Bobo Jr., Boghog, Borky22, Boston Crab, Rotoquin the Lonely Poet, Bruh, Bruno De Manos, Bunny Clyde, Boem, Cadno, Captain Rhodes, Captain Shrimp, Caramel Tortoise, Catrite Studio, CC, Cha, Chad Goulding, Chimor De Kulere, Chaflip, Chowdahound, Kristen Socal, Krista Lee, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Cipollino, Clairvoyant Longwater, Claire Cliff, Climby Coyote, CMD, Coast, Concreted, Cooksand 666, Corio, Corn Hoglin, Koifish, Crew Expendable, Judo, Cyborg Number Blue, CCR, Des Audio, Damian Thorne, Dan Matei, Danchi, David Aldris, David Crespo, Dederator, Demian Smirnoff, DRAM, Desolus, Dimension Diver, Dingus, Diodamke, DJ420 Praise It, Dr. B, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Drayton, Breton, Dropout, Duality, Duckies, Earth, Easter Egg, Echo Rose, Echo SSS, Edvard, Eggy, Elvin Senesev, Elias Alonso, Ellis Defeche, Empty Disco, Eric Shrivner, Eric Houdini, Esteban Lizama, Evan Serafet, Uwil, Explosive General Games, Fabio Picci, Factory 117, Falcus, Finish Mathai, Final Masonry, Firez, Five Side, Florida Sucks, FNM Roldy, Forbidden Dave, Frames per Human, Francis York Morgan, Freckle Lord, Fry Guy Official, Gabriel Forner, Gabby Plaget, Game Soup, Game Boy Guru, Gary Kelly, Gay Chase, Gelhoff, Gettershine, Ghost Boy, Good But Overly Long Neo Soul Songs, GPM, Hawk, Hamadawama, HDZ274, Hero Death, Hamas Hardhat, Unhearthy, HUD, Hugh, Mungus, Infinite Forest, Ink Goblin, Irandoms, Jack Walsh, Jacob Foley, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzuela, James M, Jaron, Jason, J McCarthy, JC Denton, J67, JLab, JCC, Jeremy Kellner, Jink Hans, Jin, JMD, Joey Jojo Joestar, JOH, John Kelly, John Longwalker, John Simpson, John Smith, John Walker, Johnio, Jorge Figueroa, Josaka, Joshua Patton, Josie, JT, Jurgen, K, K2, Kane Evans, K-O-Tune, K-Cub, Ken 10082, Kevin Den, King Joker, Cowken, Praise the Boys, Kuma Wamu, Kurisho, Kurt Van Ristel, Kurt Varco, Kai Arts, Kyrol, Liam Hoover, Leon 616, Loberta, Lobos, Luna Lilich, Macabre Monster, Matt Combaticus, Malaise, Maplewood, Marco, Mario, Mario Simic, Marshmallow, Matt O'Leary, Matthew Woodford, Matau Batau, Maz, Mecca Roca, Minong, Meister, Mensreya 96, Michael Del Polito, Michael Faircloth, Michael McCord, Michael Smith, Mig ZVM, Mike Mel, Milk Lipton, Milo Shamel, Mimi 573, Mr. Mamma Mia, Mitwid, M. Kusanagi, Morog, Morpai, Monroe, Monster Zero, Musashi, Mishkin, Naps 91, Nathan Grimm, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Nico Perro, Neon Dagger Games, Neon Ninja, Nervous J, Neuroshima, Nice Marmot, Nicholas Reichman, Nikki Negative, Nicole, Nickelheim, Ninth Circle Skit, Not Telnu, Not Your Beagle League, Oatware, Oklakugels, Oleg Palmasev, Oliver Gavaro, Panzer Dragoon Should Have Been Arcade, Patrick Baseman, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Powell Parole, Pedro Isiles, Philip Plus, Flop, PLP, Pocho, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, PRK, Psycho Blizzard, Queen Charlene, R2 Sinus, Raccoons, Raphael Trujillo, Randoom, Raul VP, Rapido, RC, Real Scheme, Renholtz Time, Repo Man, Retrojet, Retroman, Retro Schmupper, Victor, Ricky Fang, Robert Chang, Robert Jeffrey, Rockin' Sockin, Roop Hollander, Rory Starks, Rolf 015, Rulo, Running a Coup, Salmon Connections, Samuel Ward, Sebastian Bobola, Seymour, Senpai Please, Serial XP Greg, Shader Bunny, Shazzy, Jitsu Supreme, Shinjutsu 1600, Shiny, Shmup Junkie, Shmup Run, Shrew, Silicoid, Simon Poland, Sirapong, Skater to Employ, Sleeper, Sneed, Social Kid, Spagward, Spiders STG, Spongy, Spooky Tanuki, Steady AI, Stepleable, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superpunk, Swoop, Synthmilk, Tanzarian, Taze Ryu, Ted Ray 77, Dana Oat, The Dirty Screech, The Hidden Fortress, The Kachow, Dan 1, Yo Bensta, The Smartest Billy, Tom McCarthy, 3-Wave, Tim French, T Money, Tofu Man, Tom Faze, Travis Arbon, Tricky P, Tristan, Sugumo, Turam, Tushar Thacker, 2YU, Twilight EX, Tyler Olu, Typo Error, Unchristian, Umtal Deda, Urokeeper, Ursua, Ushimushi, Val, Vandal, Velenex, Video Game Enjoyer, Beautiful, Vincetti Briste, Wizard 16, Vlad SDG, Wabby Legs, What Is This, Willa Ross, William Miller, William Wallace, Yakiback, Yaz, Yellow Tello, Your Nerdy Joe, Eastbird, Zachary Patton, Zach Attack, Zach Zenryoku, Zero Lex, Andre Lykov.